The hardest part about watching your husband forge your signature to steal your life savings is pretending you are still asleep while he does it. My name is Ellen Taylor. I am 38 years old, and I build financial firewalls for a living. 2 days ago, I woke up in an intensive care unit in Portland, Maine, with my spine held together by titanium screws. The pain medication was heavy. The room was dark. But I was awake enough to hear my mother-in-law tell my husband to take my favorite blue fountain pen and wrap my limp fingers around it. She told him the title company needed the wet signature by noon. He did not hesitate. Before we get into how I made her the tenant of the very house she tried to steal, welcome back to Linda Vengeance. If you have ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you, you are in the right place. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Let me take you back to the exact moment the pen hit the paper. The rhythmic hiss of the room oxygen regulator and the steady chirp of the heart monitor provided the only cover sound. I kept my eyes shut. I focused on the sharp scent of clinical iodine and the cold sting of the IV needle taped to the back of my left hand. My spine burned. It was a dull, constant throb from the lumbar fusion. But the physical pain was secondary. Sylvia stood at the foot of my bed. Her voice lacked the warm, practiced cadence she used at the country club. "Did you check the hallway?" she asked. Greg shifted his weight. His shoes squeaked slightly on the linoleum. "The nurses bumped her pain meds an hour ago, just like you asked," he said. "She is out for the rest of the day. Just guide her hand and let us get this over with." I lay paralyzed, not from the spinal block, but from the chilling calculus of what was happening. I met Greg 6 years ago. He was charming, easygoing, the kind of man who remembered the names of every waiter and always held the door. He was the soft contrast to my high-pressure life as a wealth management consultant. I spent my days analyzing market volatility and securing assets for high-net-worth clients. Greg spent his managing a boutique marketing firm that never quite turned a profit. I did not mind. I had enough success for the both of us. I bought our coastal property in Cape Elizabeth with my own money before we even got married. That house was my sanctuary. It had a wraparound porch that faced the Atlantic and my grandmother's antique grandfather clock resting in the foyer. Before the surgery, I drafted a limited medical power of attorney. I left Greg to make health decisions if I became incapacitated. I drew the boundaries of that legal document with surgical precision. Yet here they were, openly discussing a title transfer. Title companies do not care about medical directives. They care about deeds, equity, and irrevocable trusts. Sylvia was not downsizing my life to help me recover. She was liquidating it. And Greg, the man who had kissed my forehead right before the anesthesia masked my consciousness, was her accomplice. The mattress dipped. Greg leaned over me. His cologne, a blend of sandalwood and expensive citrus, mingled with the sterile hospital air. He lifted my right hand. My fingers were dead weight. I let them be heavy. He pressed the hard plastic barrel of the pen into my palm. "Hold the clipboard steady," he muttered. I needed to stop this. But confronting them right now, immobile and isolated in a room where they controlled my access to the outside world, was a losing strategy. If I opened my eyes and caused a scene, Sylvia would simply tell the doctors I was suffering from post-operative psychosis. She would say the anesthesia had triggered a paranoid delusion. She already had the floor nurses doing her bidding. I had no leverage. Not yet. So I did what any good auditor does when they uncover fraud. I gathered data. I kept my breathing slow and even. I memorized the pressure of Greg's hand over mine. I listened to the sound of the nib scratching the thick, textured paper. I committed the exact timing of the forgery to memory. "Done," Greg whispered. He pulled the pen away. "The house is out of her name. We have to file this before the wire cut off." They turned and walked toward the door. Sylvia paused. "Take her cell phone," she said. "We cannot risk her waking up and checking her banking app. Tell the nurses she needs 0 stimulation for the next 48 hours. No screens, no visitors." Greg patted the bedside table, sliding my phone into his pocket. The door clicked shut. My eyes snapped open. I reached across the metal bed rail for the plastic nurse call button. I pulled it toward me. The cord ended in a frayed cluster of wires. It had been unplugged from the wall. I was trapped in a room I could not walk out of, locked out of my own life, and the legal clock had just started ticking. But Greg and Sylvia made one critical error. They assumed silence meant surrender. They did not realize that 10 minutes before they walked in, I had used a voice command to activate the recording app on my smartwatch. The door clicked shut. The silence in the intensive care unit became a tangible weight pressing down on my chest. I stared at the acoustic ceiling tiles, counting the small perforations to keep my mind tethered to logic. My body was a useless anchor. The surgical fusion in my lower lumbar spine dictated every shallow breath I took. I could not sit upright. I could not twist my torso. I could not even reach the door handle. The unplugged nurse call button dangled over the metal bed rail like a dead snake, a physical taunt reminding me of my isolation. Greg had taken my cell phone, severing my primary connection to my banking infrastructure, my legal team, and my firm. He thought he had orchestrated a perfect blackout, but my husband lacked a fundamental understanding of redundancy. Wealth management requires backup systems, contingency plans, and fail-safes. I turned my left wrist a fraction of an inch against the crisp hospital sheets. The black square of my smartwatch illuminated in the dim light. My throat felt like sandpaper, dry and raw from the surgical intubation tube, but I managed a raspy, deliberate voice command. End recording, save file. The tiny screen flashed a green confirmation checkmark. The audio file of my husband forging my signature was secure in the cloud server. I had the crime preserved on tape. But digital evidence is entirely worthless if you cannot deliver it to a courtroom or a litigator. 30 minutes later, the heavy door swung open. A nurse walked in. Her badge read Brenda. She did not make eye contact with me. She moved with a brisk mechanical efficiency, checking my IV drip and charting the glowing vitals on the cardiac monitor. I tried to speak. My voice was a brittle croak. "I need to make a phone call," I managed to say, forcing the words past my dry lips. Brenda paused. She pulled a pre-filled plastic syringe from her scrub pocket and injected the clear liquid directly into my IV line port. "Your mother-in-law warned us you might experience some severe confusion from the anesthesia," Brenda said. Her tone dripped with practiced clinical condescension. "Mr. Taylor instructed the staff to keep you resting. No screens, no stress. You are safe here, Ellen. Just close your eyes and go to sleep." A cold, numbing wave washed through my veins as the new dose of synthetic painkillers hit my bloodstream. They had planned this variable perfectly. Sylvia had painted me as a fragile, paranoid surgical patient. Any desperate claim I made about stolen coastal houses, forged deeds, or corporate raids would be charted in my medical file as a narcotic hallucination. I fought the heavy, suffocating tide of the medication. I dug my fingernails into my own palms, using the sharp sting to anchor myself in the waking world. I needed an outside proxy. I needed someone who understood the exact brand of venom Sylvia produced, someone who would not be charmed by Greg's easy smile. The afternoon bled into a gray, overcast Maine evening. The hospital corridor transitioned into the chaotic, overlapping hum of the shift change. Medical supply carts rattled over the tile. Doctors dictated notes. In that brief window of systemic distraction, my room door opened a crack. It was not Greg returning. It was not Brenda checking my pulse. A woman slipped inside, closing the heavy wooden door silently behind her. She wore a tailored tan trench coat and carried a structured leather tote bag. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense clasp. Maria, Greg's older sister. We were not close friends. Maria had emancipated herself from Sylvia's toxic, controlling orbit a decade ago. She moved across the state to run an independent commercial logistics firm, refusing to participate in the country club facade. She rarely attended family holidays, preferring the quiet peace of her self-imposed exile. But she possessed a cynical, razor-sharp intellect that I always respected. She stepped up to the edge of the bed. Her dark eyes scanned the unplugged call button, the lowered window blinds, and my rigid, unnatural posture. My mother left me a frantic voicemail saying you suffered a mental break in the recovery room, Maria whispered, leaning against the cold metal bed rail. She explicitly told me not to visit you, which naturally is exactly why I drove 3 hours down the coast to get here. What did they do to you, Ellen? I did not have the lung capacity for a long, detailed explanation. I lifted my left wrist. Play recent audio, I rasped. The smartwatch speaker was tiny, but the acoustic quality was clear enough to capture the betrayal. The quiet hospital room filled with the recorded voices of her brother and her mother, the instruction to take the blue fountain pen, the confirmation of the title company deadline, the direct order to confiscate my phone and isolate me from the medical staff. Maria listened without blinking. Her jaw tightened, the muscles flexing visibly beneath her pale skin. When the short recording ended, she let out a slow, measured breath. They forged the Cape Elizabeth deed, I whispered, fighting the exhaustion dragging at my eyelids. They are transferring the property out of my name. Maria shook her head, her mind already working through the complex variables of the theft. Sylvia does not want that house to live in, she said, her voice dripping with disgust. The property taxes alone would annoy her. She wants the liquid equity. They are using your limited medical power of attorney to bypass the standard notary requirements. She will claim you were medically incapacitated, unable to manage your affairs, and she bravely stepped in to handle your financial obligations to save you from ruin. It is classic Sylvia. She sets the house on fire, then charges you for the bucket of water. I nodded, wincing, as a sharp spike of nerve pain radiated down my legs. I need to reach David, I said, referring to my corporate litigation attorney. We have to freeze the accounts before the wire clears tomorrow morning. If they extract the equity, the money will disappear into offshore holding accounts. Maria reached into her trench coat pocket and pulled out her own smartphone. Call him right now, she said, unlocking the glowing screen and holding it toward me. I shook my head, refusing to take the device. The hospital routes all cellular data through their internal monitored network in this specific surgical wing to prevent equipment interference, I explained. If I log into my financial portals or send encrypted emails on your device, it pings the hospital server. Sylvia has the floor supervisor in her pocket. If she is tracking my digital footprint, she will instantly know I am awake and fighting back. She will expedite the transfer to happen tonight. We cannot use any device tied to a public or monitored network. Maria understood the tactical disadvantage immediately. In the logistics business, a compromised supply chain meant you had to secure a shadow route. She slipped her sleek phone back into her coat pocket. You need a ghost device, she stated flatly. An unregistered burner phone. Cash purchase, no contract. Something that runs on a separate, untraceable cellular band. Yes, I breathed, feeling the narcotic haze threatening to pull me under again. But Greg took my wallet and my credit cards. I have zero liquidity to buy one. Maria unzipped her leather tote bag and pulled out a thick metal money clip holding a stack of $100 bills. Consider this an initial investment in watching my mother finally face a consequence, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. I will drive to a big box electronics store in the suburbs. I can be back here with a prepaid smartphone and a secure wireless hotspot in under an hour. We are going to audit their entire lives. She turned toward the exit, her hand resting on the brushed steel door handle. But the tension in the room suddenly spiked, shattering our brief moment of strategy. Heavy, familiar footsteps echoed on the linoleum in the hallway, stopping right outside my room. Through the frosted glass panel of the door, the unmistakable broad silhouette of a man appeared. He was speaking to the charge nurse, his voice muffled, but carrying that same easy, charming cadence he used to forge my signature. Greg had returned, and he was standing directly between Maria and the only physical exit, cutting off my outside proxy before our operation could even begin. Maria did not freeze when the brushed steel door handle clicked. She possessed the hardened reflexes of a woman who had spent a decade outmaneuvering corporate supply chain disasters. Before Greg could push the door inward, Maria grasped the handle and pulled it open herself. She stepped squarely into the threshold, her tailored tan trench coat forming a visual barrier that blocked her brother from seeing my rigid posture or the unplugged call button dangling over the bed rail. Greg stopped short. His expensive leather shoes squeaked on the linoleum. "Maria," he said, his voice dropping a full octave in surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I heard Mother was running a triage unit in the waiting room," Maria replied. Her tone was a masterclass in detached boredom. "I came to check if my sister-in-law survived the surgery or if our mother had already planned the catering for the wake." "This is a restricted recovery ward," Greg snapped, recovering his footing. "You are not on the approved visitor list." Maria adjusted the strap of her leather tote bag. "And yet, here I am." "She looks terrible, Greg. Maybe try letting her rest instead of hovering like a vulture." She brushed past him without waiting for a response, her heels clicking a steady, unbothered rhythm down the corridor. Greg stood in the doorway for a long moment. I regulated my breathing, keeping my chest rising and falling in the slow, shallow cadence of a deep, narcotic slumber. He stepped into the room. I felt his gaze sweeping over the bed, checking the monitors, looking for any sign of disturbance. The room was silent, except for the hiss of the oxygen valve. Satisfied that his forged signature remained a secret, he turned and left, closing the heavy wooden door behind him. An hour later, a hospital dietary aide walked into my room, carrying a plastic tray with a bowl of lukewarm broth and a cup of ice chips. She set the tray on the adjustable rolling table, smiled politely, and left without saying a word. I reached for the folded paper napkin resting next to the plastic spoon. Beneath the thin white paper was a cheap, prepaid smartphone wrapped in a black silicone case. Maria had bypassed the medical staff entirely, utilizing the hospital catering crew to smuggle the device. I powered on the burner phone. The bright glare of the uncalibrated screen stung my eyes in the dim room, but the signal bars in the top corner showed a full connection to a separate cellular network. I bypassed the hospital Wi-Fi and opened the messaging app. I typed a phone number from memory. It belonged to David, my trusted corporate litigation attorney. David was a relentless tactician in downtown Portland, the kind of lawyer who wore impeccable suits and viewed legal disputes as a game of chess. Greg and Sylvia forged my signature on a deed transfer for the Cape Elizabeth property while I was under anesthesia, I typed. My fingers felt thick and clumsy, fighting the lingering effects of the painkillers. Initiate a forensic trace on all my personal accounts. Find out where the asset is moving. I hit send. The delivery receipt confirmed the message had bypassed the hospital firewall. A brief wave of triumph washed over me. I had secured a lifeline. But that triumph evaporated less than 2 hours later. The door opened, and the day shift charge nurse marched in holding a clipboard. She did not check my vitals. She unclipped a bright red laminated notice and slid it into the plastic sleeve on the exterior of my door. "Mr. Taylor has updated your medical directive," she announced, her voice flat and uncompromising. "You are now under a strict privacy lockdown. Only immediate medical personnel are allowed in this wing. Your sister-in-law, Maria, has been explicitly barred from the premises by hospital security." The nurse turned on her heel and left. My stomach tightened into a cold knot. How did Sylvia know? The burner phone was unregistered. The cellular network was independent. The only external contact I'd made was to David. My mind began to race, calculating variables and searching for the vulnerability in my secure communication line. I am a wealth management consultant. My instinct is to follow the data. The data pointed to a leak inside David's law firm. I focused my rising paranoia on a junior associate named Evan. Evan was a brilliant but ambitious young lawyer on David's tax desk. 6 months ago, Evan had handled the corporate tax filings for Sylvia's real estate brokerage. He knew her accounts. He knew her influence in the Portland business community. If David had tasked his junior team with initiating the forensic trace on my accounts, Evan would have seen the inquiry. Did Evan tip off Sylvia to curry favor with a wealthy, powerful client? The suspicion gnawed at me. It forced me to alter my strategy. I could not risk sending clear, explicit instructions to David if a mole was reading the internal communications. I wasted precious hours drafting elaborate coded text messages on the burner phone. I typed phrases designed to bypass a junior associate's comprehension while still alerting David to the urgency. Review the coastal portfolio pipeline, I wrote. Shield the inquiry from the secondary tax desk. Isolate the data pool. Constructing these cryptic messages drained my limited energy. The mental gymnastics slowed down the forensic trace, costing me valuable time. I lay in the dark, convinced I was fighting a sophisticated corporate espionage battle. The red herring consumed my focus. Night fell over Portland. The hospital corridor transitioned into the quiet, eerie stillness of the graveyard shift. The fluorescent lights in the hallway dimmed. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to decipher David's vague, equally cautious replies. Then the tension broke, revealing a truth far more disturbing than a leaked legal email. The heavy wooden door to my room was cracked open perhaps an inch, allowing a sliver of yellow light to cut across the linoleum floor. Brenda, the night nurse, who had administered my medication earlier, was standing just outside the door, leaning against the hallway wall. She was speaking in a hushed, conspiratorial tone on her personal cell phone. "Yes, Mrs. Taylor," Brenda whispered. "The restricted visitor list is active across all shift changes. No, the sister-in-law cannot get back in. Security has her photo at the front desk." I stopped breathing. The sound of Sylvia's name hit me like a physical blow. "Of course I will make sure she stays sedated," Brenda continued, her voice dripping with sycophantic eagerness. "And I just wanted to say thank you again for the sponsor letter to the Portland Country Club. My husband was thrilled. Getting past the membership committee has been a dream of ours for years." Brenda ended the call. The realization washed over me cold and clarifying. There was no leak at David's law firm. Evan, the junior associate, was entirely innocent. Sylvia had simply weaponized her social currency. She had traded a coveted country club membership for the loyalty of a night nurse. My medical care was not just compromised, it was actively hostile. Sylvia was using the hospital staff to keep me drugged, silent, and trapped. The door pushed open. Brenda walked in holding a small paper cup containing 2 blue and white capsules. "It is time for your pain management, Ellen," she said, offering a practiced hollow smile. I looked at the capsules. Oxycodone, the synthetic narcotic that kept the crushing agony of my spinal fusion at bay. If I swallowed those pills, my mind would drift back into the heavy, compliant fog Sylvia required for her plan to succeed. I needed my intellect sharp. I needed my memory flawless. I reached out with a trembling hand and took the small paper cup. I brought it to my lips, tossing the capsules toward the back of my mouth. Brenda handed me a plastic cup of water. I took a sip, but I did not swallow. I used my tongue to push the capsules deep into the space between my lower gums and my cheek. I gulped the water, making a loud, convincing swallowing sound. "There you go," Brenda said, satisfied. "Just let the medication do its work." She turned and left the room, closing the door until it latched. The moment I was alone, I spat the dissolving capsules into a tissue, wiping the bitter, chalky residue from my tongue. I shoved the tissue deep into the pocket of my hospital gown. Within 40 minutes, the residual painkillers in my bloodstream began to fade. The reality of the spinal fusion roared to life. It did not feel like a dull ache anymore. It felt like a jagged, heated blade twisting directly into my lower vertebrae with every heartbeat. The physical agony was blinding. Sweat beaded on my forehead. I gripped the metal bed rails until my knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to scream. I chose the pain. I embraced the excruciating physical toll because it meant my mind was finally clear. The narcotic fog burned away, leaving behind a cold, crystalline focus. The burner phone vibrated against my hip. I picked it up with a shaking hand. A text from David illuminated the dark room. He had ignored my coded messages and bulldozed straight through the financial trace. "The forensic audit is complete," David wrote. "Sylvia is not selling the Cape Elizabeth house to a third-party buyer. She used the forged deed to transfer the property into a shell holding company. She is using the house as collateral to extract a high-interest equity loan. The bank wire is scheduled to clear at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. It was currently 2 in the morning. I was trapped in a hostile medical facility, fighting blinding physical agony, and I had exactly 7 hours to stop my mother-in-law from liquidating my entire life. I stared at the glowing numbers on the burner phone screen. 2 in the morning. I had exactly 7 hours until the bank wire triggered. The sheer audacity of the crime began to take shape in my mind. A traditional mortgage requires 30 days of underwriting, income verification, and extensive credit checks. Sylvia was not navigating a traditional real estate sale. She was utilizing a hard money lender. These predatory financial institutions only care about the collateral. The coastal sanctuary I built in Cape Elizabeth possessed immense, unencumbered equity. Sylvia used the forged deed to transfer the title into a newly formed limited liability company. With that corporate shell holding the asset, the hard money lender would approve a high-interest loan based solely on the property value. The funds would wire directly into a corporate account controlled by my mother-in-law. By noon, that cash would be routed through a complex labyrinth of offshore holding accounts, rendering the capital untraceable and untouchable. I would be left holding the deed to a house saddled with a crushing, unpayable lien. The lender would foreclose. I would lose my home, my credit, and my financial independence, while Sylvia walked away with the liquid capital. I typed a response to David. My fingers were slick with cold sweat. Draft an emergency revocation of the medical power of attorney. Prepare a cease and desist injunction for the title company. The reply came 3 minutes later. I have the documents ready. But a revocation requires a wet signature and a licensed notary. I cannot just email this injunction to the bank. I need to walk into your intensive care unit and watch you physically sign the paper. Greg instituted a strict privacy lockdown on your medical file. The hospital administration views him as your legal proxy. If I walk through the front lobby, hospital security will block me at the elevators. They will cite patient privacy laws and force me to leave the premises. I closed my eyes. The sharp, jagged pain radiating from my lumbar spine threatened to pull me into a state of shock. I focused my mind on the problem. Wealth management is essentially the practice of finding loopholes in rigid bureaucratic systems. A hospital is just another rigid system. I opened my eyes and typed my instructions. Do not ask the front desk for permission. Contact a state-appointed patient advocate. Bring them with you to the hospital. When the legal counsel tries to block you, threaten them with a federal civil rights lawsuit for denying a conscious patient access to legal representation. Make the liability of keeping you out higher than the liability of letting you in. Understood, David replied. I will be there at dawn. The intervening hours were a brutal exercise in physical endurance. I had spat out the synthetic narcotics to keep my intellect sharp. Now I had to pay the toll. Every time the ventilation system hummed, the subtle vibration of the floorboards sent a fresh wave of agony up my spinal column. My hospital gown was soaked in perspiration. I kept my breathing measured, feigning the deep, untroubled sleep of a heavily sedated patient every time Brenda checked the cardiac monitors. If the corrupt nurse noticed my elevated heart rate, she would inject a sedative directly into my intravenous port. I spent the dark hours mapping the ceiling tiles, translating my physical suffering into a cold, calculated fury. The sun finally crested over Casco Bay, painting the sterile walls of my room in a pale gray light. 7 in the morning brought the shift change. Brenda documented her final notes and left the ward. A new charge nurse arrived. She was a stern, efficient woman who adjusted my blankets without a word and reset the fluid drip. I checked the burner phone hidden beneath my thigh. 8:15, 45 minutes until the wire transfer cleared. If David failed to breach the hospital security protocols, the money was gone forever. At 8:22, the quiet hum of the corridor shattered. Voices echoed outside my door, firm, authoritative tones cutting through the clinical hush. I cannot allow you to enter this ward, a man said. It was the hospital risk manager. The patient proxy explicitly barred outside visitors. I heard David respond. His voice was a flat, unyielding weapon, a courtroom tactic he used to dismantle hostile witnesses. I am not a visitor. I am retained legal counsel. This woman is a state-appointed ombudsman. Under Maine civil statute, a conscious patient retains the right to legal representation, regardless of a proxy directive. If you instruct security to lay a hand on me, I will file a federal injunction against this hospital before your morning coffee gets cold. The door handle turned. David stepped into the room. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his leather briefcase clutched in his left hand. Behind him stood a nervous-looking notary public, holding a bound ledger and a brass embosser. The hospital risk manager hovered in the doorway, his face flushed with indignation. But he did not step over the threshold. The threat of a federal civil rights lawsuit had paralyzed his authority. David moved to the side of my bed. He took one look at my pale, sweat-drenched face and understood I had rejected the pain medication. He did not waste time with pleasantries or sympathetic gestures. He unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents. "We have 14 minutes," David said. He placed the rigid clipboard on my lap. "I need your signature on the revocation, the cease and desist, and the affidavit of forgery." I had to raise my torso to properly grip the pen. The movement sent a blinding flash of white-hot pain through my central nervous system. I gritted my teeth, tasting copper, as I bit the inside of my cheek. I grasped the pen. My hand shook with uncontrollable tremors. I forced my wrist to steady, drawing upon every ounce of willpower I possessed. I pressed the black ink to the paper. The signature was jagged, lacking its usual fluid grace, but it was legally binding. I signed the first page. The notary stamped the seal. I signed the second. Another heavy stamp echoed in the quiet room. "Done," I gasped, falling back against the pillows. My vision blurred around the edges. David snatched the clipboard. He handed the notary a crisp bill for her services and turned toward the door. "I will serve the title company," David said, his voice tight with adrenaline. "I will slam this on the closing agent desk before the clock strikes 9. He sprinted out of the room, his dress shoes echoing down the hallway. I lay in the quiet aftermath, staring at the ceiling. The physical toll of sitting up had drained my remaining reserves. The clock on the wall ticked forward. 8:45. I closed my eyes, waiting for the confirmation text that my coastal sanctuary was safe. But the silence in the corridor did not last. Heavy footsteps approached my room again. I cracked my eyes open, expecting the risk manager returning to reprimand me for the legal stunt. Instead, Sylvia stood in the doorway. She was not downtown at the title company collecting her stolen equity. She was here. She held a thick yellow medical file in her manicured hands. Beside her stood an older man wearing a white coat, bearing the title of Chief of Psychiatry. Sylvia looked at me with a cold, predatory smile. Her financial theft was stalling, so she was pivoting her strategy. She raised her voice, adopting a tone of profound, heartbreaking maternal concern. Dr. Sylvia said, gesturing toward my bed, "As you can see, my daughter-in-law is suffering from a severe post-operative psychotic break. She requires an involuntary psychiatric hold." The older man in the white coat stepped into the sterile light of my recovery room. His badge identified him as Dr. Eris, Chief of Psychiatry. He carried a tablet and a posture of practiced neutral authority. Sylvia stood just behind his right shoulder, dabbing the corners of her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Her performance was impeccable. She projected the precise image of a devastated, exhausted matriarch, forced to make a tragic medical decision for a beloved family member. My burner phone vibrated against my thigh beneath the thin cotton blanket. A single, short pulse. David had succeeded. The timing was too precise for any other outcome. He had marched into the title company and slammed the cease and desist order onto the closing agent desk before the 9 o'clock wire cutoff. The equity loan was frozen. My coastal sanctuary remained mine. The digital theft had failed, leaving Sylvia with nothing but a forged deed and an imminent legal disaster. But Sylvia did not know the wire transfer was halted yet. She was here to execute her contingency plan. If she could have me declared mentally incompetent, she could reinstate the revoked power of attorney and overwrite the injunction David had just filed. She intended to lock me in a psychiatric ward, stripping away my legal autonomy, so she could finish draining my assets unchecked. Dr. Aris approached the bed rail. "Good morning, Ellen," he stated, keeping his tone calm and unthreatening. "Your mother-in-law has expressed deep concern regarding your postoperative behavior. She submitted a formal petition stating you are experiencing severe paranoia and delusions. I need to ask you a few standard questions to assess your cognitive orientation." I looked at the doctor. The physical agony in my fused lumbar spine was a blinding, relentless fire. I had rejected the synthetic narcotics hours ago to keep my intellect sharp, and my central nervous system was paying the heavy toll. My skin was damp with cold sweat. My heart hammered against my ribs. To any outside observer, I appeared erratic, distressed, and highly unstable. Sylvia was counting on my physical suffering to validate her narrative of a psychotic break. She thinks her husband is trying to steal her house. Sylvia whispered to the doctor, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. She was screaming about corporate raids and offshore bank accounts. The anesthesia has triggered some kind of terrifying paranoid episode. She even forced a lawyer into this room earlier to sign documents she does not understand. Dr. Aris nodded sympathetically to Sylvia, then turned his focus back to me. "Ellen, can you tell me the current date, the name of this hospital, and who the current president is?" I took a slow, shallow breath, forcing the air past the dry rasp in my throat. I answered the 3 baseline questions flawlessly. Aris tapped his tablet. "Good. Now, can you count backward from 100 by sevens? 93, 86, 79, 72, 65. I recited, keeping my cadence metronomic and hollow. I did not break eye contact with him. The psychiatrist paused, studying my face. "Your mother-in-law claims you are suffering from acute financial delusions. Can you explain why you summoned legal counsel to your bedside hours after a major spinal operation?" I could not afford to sound angry. Anger reads as instability. I needed to speak the only language that possessed irrefutable authority. I grew up in a household where numbers were the primary dialect. My late father was a risk actuary, and my mother was a senior estate planner. I spent my childhood reading amortization schedules at the breakfast table instead of comic books. Logic is my native tongue. "I'm a wealth management consultant," I replied, my voice cool and deliberate, despite the jagged pain tearing through my back. I did not summon an attorney due to a delusion. I summoned him to halt a fraudulent asset transfer. Sylvia let out a dramatic, muffled sob. "You see, doctor, she is entirely detached from reality." I ignored her performance and addressed the psychiatrist directly. "I can prove my lucidity right now, Dr. Aris. Let us discuss the exact mechanics of a hard money equity loan. A traditional mortgage requires 30 days of underwriting. A hard money lender processes loans in 48 hours, based solely on the unencumbered equity of the collateral. The asset in question is my coastal property, located in Cape Elizabeth, which I purchased prior to my marriage." Aris lowered his tablet, his brow furrowing as he listened to my precise terminology. "The woman standing behind you forged my signature on a deed transfer yesterday afternoon." I continued enunciating every syllable. "She moved my title into a newly formed limited liability company. That corporate shell is designed to shield her identity while extracting a high-interest loan. If that wire transfer clears, she will route the liquid capital through a series of offshore holding accounts to evade domestic taxation and audit trails. This constitutes wire fraud under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1343, and money laundering under Section 1956. The sterile hospital room fell dead silent. Sylvia lowered her monogrammed handkerchief. The manufactured tears vanished, replaced by a rigid, breathless panic. She had expected me to scream, to cry, to hurl wild accusations about her character. She did not expect a clinical recitation of federal banking statutes. I was not finished. My legal counsel arrived this morning to file an emergency injunction at the local title company to freeze the escrow account I stated. I signed a revocation of the medical proxy because my mother-in-law is utilizing this hospital stay to facilitate a corporate crime. My heart rate is elevated and I am sweating because I refused the morning dose of oxycodone. I required my executive function to remain unimpaired so I could dismantle her theft. Dr. Aris stared at me for a long moment. He looked down at the medical chart on his tablet, noting my refusal of the prescribed narcotics. He then turned to look at Sylvia. The sympathy in his eyes had evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating skepticism. "She is making this up," Sylvia stammered, stepping backward toward the door. "It is a fabricated story she read in a financial magazine. She is deeply unwell." Dr. Aris clicked his stylus against the screen of his tablet. "Mrs. Taylor," he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of a stern reprimand, "a patient experiencing post-operative psychosis exhibits fragmented thought processes, visual hallucinations, and disjointed speech. Your daughter-in-law just delivered a flawless legal and financial audit of her personal estate while managing unmedicated spinal trauma. Her cognitive function is exceptionally sharp." He turned his back on Sylvia and stepped closer to my bed. He signed his digital signature across the bottom of my chart. "You are fully lucid," Ellen Aris declared. "I am dismissing the psychiatric petition. You retain full autonomy over your medical and legal decisions." "Thank you, doctor," I whispered. Aris glanced over his shoulder. "I strongly advise you to leave this ward, Mrs. Taylor," he told Sylvia. "Falsifying a psychiatric petition to restrict a patient is a severe violation of hospital policy. If you attempt to interfere with her recovery again, I will personally contact hospital security and ask them to escort you off the premises." Sylvia opened her mouth to argue, but the sheer unforgiving authority in the psychiatrist's tone shut her down. Her carefully constructed facade of maternal concern crumbled into ash. She glared at me, her eyes burning with a venomous, unmasked hatred. Without another word, she turned on her heel and fled the room, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Dr. Aris gave me a curt, respectful nod and walked out, leaving the heavy wooden door open a crack. I let my head sink into the pillows, allowing a shaky exhale to escape my lips. I had won the psychological siege. I had protected my legal autonomy and humiliated my enemy in front of the medical administration. Sylvia could no longer hide behind the guise of a concerned family member. Her weaponization of the hospital staff was broken. The burner phone vibrated again. I pulled it from beneath the blanket and opened the unencrypted text message from David. "Injunction filed," the message read. "The title company halted the equity loan. Your house is secure." But the closing agent handed me a copy of the LLC incorporation documents Sylvia used to initiate the loan. "The holding company is registered to a post office box in Portland. We have a major problem." I frowned, ignoring the burning sensation in my spine as I typed a rapid response. "What is the problem?" "The wire is stopped." "The paper trail," David replied. "The LLC is active. If Sylvia realizes the loan failed, she will immediately destroy the physical ledger containing the offshore routing numbers and the original forged deed. Those documents are the only physical evidence tying her to the federal wire fraud attempt. Without them, it is her word against yours regarding the forgery. Do you know where she keeps her financial records?" My blood ran cold. I knew exactly where those records were hidden. They were not at Sylvia's downtown real estate brokerage, and they were not in a bank vault. They were locked inside the Cape Elizabeth house, hidden in the exact property she was trying to steal. She had 20 minutes to drive from the hospital to the coast. If Sylvia reached the property first, she would incinerate the ledger and erase the paper trail forever. I was bound to a hospital bed, physically incapable of stopping her. To secure the evidence that would send her to federal prison, I had to orchestrate a break-in of my own home, and I had to do it remotely. I stared at the glowing text message from David. The LLC holding my stolen title was registered to a local post office box, meaning the physical corporate ledger and the original forged deed were not sitting in a downtown bank vault. Sylvia kept her sensitive financial records close. I knew this because I spent 6 years observing her meticulous, controlling nature. She did not trust digital cloud servers or third-party accountants with her true vulnerabilities. She kept paper, and right now, those papers were hidden inside the Cape Elizabeth house. I typed a new message on the burner phone, sending it to Maria. Sylvia just lost her psychiatric gamble. She knows the equity loan is frozen. She will drive to the coast to incinerate the LLC ledger and erase the paper trail. Where are you? The reply illuminated my screen 10 seconds later. I am in my car. I just crossed the Casco Bay Bridge. I can reach the property in 15 minutes. Tell me how to get inside. Maria operated a commercial logistics firm, a career built on navigating supply chain disruptions and executing precision timelines. She did not ask unnecessary questions or offer empty emotional comforts. She understood the tactical reality. If Sylvia destroyed that ledger, the federal wire fraud evidence would turn to ash, and the forgery would devolve into a messy, unprovable domestic dispute. We needed the physical documents. I called their number. The hospital room felt suffocatingly quiet as I pressed the plastic speaker to my ear. Maria answered on the first ring. The background noise of her car engine and the rush of highway wind filled the line. Do not use the front driveway, I instructed, keeping my voice low and measured. My fused spine throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, but the adrenaline masked the worst of the trauma. Park on the unpaved access road behind the property. The trees will hide your vehicle from the street. I am turning onto the coastal highway now, Maria said. The fog is rolling in thick. Visibility is dropping. It works to our advantage. How do I bypass the security system? Greg installed those perimeter cameras last year. He installed them, but I configured the network, I replied. The cameras upload to a local server in the basement, but the motion sensors trigger an alert to his cell phone. You cannot use the main doors. Go to the wooden deck on the east side of the house. There is a secondary utility door leading into the mudroom. It relies on an analog deadbolt, not a digital keypad. I heard the sound of her tires transitioning from smooth asphalt to crunching gravel. She had reached the access road. The engine cut out. The line went silent save for the distant, rhythmic crash of the Atlantic waves striking the rocky Maine shoreline. I am at the utility door, Maria whispered, her breathing slightly elevated. It is locked solid. Look beneath the ceramic planter resting next to the drain pipe, I told her. Greg thinks he is a master of security, but he is fundamentally lazy. He always hides a spare brass key there because he forgets his ring when he takes the trash out. I heard the scrape of pottery moving against wood, followed by the metallic clink of the key sliding into the lock. The heavy door groaned open. You are in, I breathed. Do not turn on any overhead lights. Use your phone screen to navigate. I am standing in the mudroom, Maria said. The house is freezing. They turned the thermostat down. Where is the safe? There is no safe, I corrected her. A steel safe is an invitation for a search warrant. Sylvia taught Greg to hide things in plain sight. Walk through the kitchen and enter the main foyer. I listened to the soft, calculated tread of her boots moving across the hardwood floors. I closed my eyes, mapping the coastal house in my mind. I could picture the dark silhouette of the kitchen island, the pale moonlight filtering through the large bay windows, and the vast, empty space of the living room, where my life had been systematically boxed up. I am in the foyer, Maria reported. I see the front door. I see the staircase. What am I looking for? Look to your left, I said. A heavy, measured ticking sound echoed through the phone speaker. The antique grandfather clock. It belonged to my grandmother. It stood 7 feet tall, constructed of polished mahogany and beveled glass. I had transported it to Maine when I bought the house, a testament to my own family legacy. Open the glass panel protecting the pendulum, I instructed. I heard the squeak of the small brass hinge. The ticking grew louder, a steady, mechanical heartbeat in the dark house. Reach behind the brass pendulum disc, I said. Feel the back panel of the wooden casing. There should be a thick manila envelope taped to the wood. A moment of tense silence stretched across the cellular connection. Then the distinct sound of heavy adhesive ripping away from wood filled my ear. "I have it," Maria confirmed. "It is heavy. Feels like a bound ledger and several thick files." "Get out of the house," I commanded. "Go back through the mudroom and get to your car." Before Maria could acknowledge the order, a sudden, blinding sweep of light flashed across the foyer. Even through the phone, I could hear the harsh crunch of tires braking aggressively on the front gravel driveway. The headlights cut through the front bay windows, illuminating the dark walls of the house. "Someone is here," Maria hissed. "The engine is still running." "It is Greg," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Sylvia must have sent him to secure the documents while she deals with the hospital administration. You do not have time to reach the utility door in the back. He will see your flashlight beam crossing the kitchen." I heard the heavy metallic clunk of a car door slamming shut. Footsteps crunched rapidly across the gravel path leading to the front porch. "The terrace doors," I urged, my voice tight with urgency. "To your right. Slip through the sliding glass and drop down into the garden. Go, now!" Keys jingled just inches from Maria. The front door lock tumbled. Maria moved. I heard the swift slide of the glass terrace door opening, the rush of cold, salt air entering the house, and the soft thud of her boots landing in the damp garden soil. Just as the glass door slid shut, the heavy front door swung open. A harsh overhead light flicked on, flooding the foyer. I heard Greg cursing under his breath, his heavy footsteps rushing past the exact spot where Maria had been standing 10 seconds prior. He marched straight toward the grandfather clock. I held my breath, gripping the hospital bed sheets. Over the phone line, I heard the rustle of coastal grass as Maria sprinted toward the tree line, using the dense Maine fog as physical cover. "Where is it?" Greg shouted inside the house, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. His tone was frantic, laced with a rising, unfiltered panic. "Where is the envelope?" Maria reached her vehicle. The car door opened and closed with a muted thud. She locked the doors. The sound of her ragged breathing filled the speaker. "I am secure," she gasped. "I have the ledger. I am pulling back onto the coastal highway." He did not see me. "Drive to David," I said, letting out a long, shaky exhale. "Hand the documents directly to his custody. The chain of evidence must remain unbroken." "I am turning the dome light on," Maria said, the sound of thick paper tearing reaching my ears. "I am opening the envelope right now. Let us see what my brother was trying to burn." There was a long, heavy pause. The ambient noise of the car heater whirred in the background. Ellen Maria whispered. Her voice carried a strange, uncharacteristic tremor. The cynical detachment was gone, replaced by a cold, dawning shock. "What is it?" I asked, forcing myself to sit upright, despite the searing pain in my spine. "Are the forged deeds in the file?" "Yes, the deeds are here," Maria replied, flipping through the heavy pages. "But you were wrong about the corporate structure. Greg is not the mastermind of this theft. He is not even the primary beneficiary." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my mind racing through the financial variables. "I am looking at the articles of incorporation for the Shell LLC. Maria explained, her tone hardening into a sharp edge of realization. "Greg is listed as a liable guarantor, a disposable proxy. He holds zero equity in this holding company." "Then who owns the LLC?" I asked, though the answer was already forming like ice in my veins. Our mother Maria stated flatly. "Sylvia is the sole managing member, and I am looking at her corporate escrow accounts. Ellen Sylvia is short millions of dollars at her real estate brokerage. She is facing a federal audit. She did not orchestrate this to buy Greg a new life. She is stealing your house to quietly refill her own embezzled escrow accounts before the federal government kicks her office doors down." The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. Greg was not the architect of my ruin. He was merely a pawn, manipulated by his own mother into stealing from his wife, positioned to take the fall for a federal corporate crime. And Sylvia, cornered and desperate, was about to launch a psychological war to ensure I never saw the light of a courtroom. The dawn light filtering through the hospital blinds felt thin and cold. I lay motionless, processing the seismic shift Maria had just triggered over the burner phone. For 48 hours, I had operated under a singular logical assumption. I believed Greg was a desperate husband, drowning in bad investments, driven to steal his successful wife's assets to save his own skin. It was a painful narrative, but it made mathematical sense. Men with bruised egos and hidden debts frequently resort to domestic financial abuse. But Maria had unraveled that theory with a single glance at the ledger. 30 minutes later, David walked into my recovery room. He did not knock. He carried the thick manila envelope Maria had handed off to him in a suburban parking lot. His charcoal suit was wrinkled, a rare lapse in his normally immaculate presentation. He pulled the rolling tray table closer to my bed and unclasped the envelope, spilling the heavy, yellowed ledger and crisp legal documents across the sterile plastic surface. Maria was correct. David stated, his voice a low, resonant hum. He handed me a stack of papers clipped together. The forensic audit matches the physical documents she pulled from your grandfather clock. Read the incorporation articles for the shell company holding your forged deed. I propped myself up on my left elbow. A white-hot spike of nerve pain shot down my fused lumbar spine, but I ignored it. I took the papers. The corporate structure was laid out in stark, undeniable black and white. The limited liability company was registered under Sylvia's legal name as the sole managing member. Greg was listed on page 4, buried in the fine print, as a secondary guarantor. He possessed 0 equity, 0 voting rights, and 0 control over the asset dispersal. If the hard money loan had cleared, Greg would have been legally responsible for the repayment, but Sylvia would have controlled every cent of the liquid cash. Look at the liability column on the second page, David instructed, tapping a manicured finger against the ledger. I scanned the numbers. Greg operated a boutique marketing firm that generated more social media posts than actual revenue. I knew he carried some quiet debt, but the ledger revealed his offshore liabilities amounted to less than $80,000. It was a significant sum for a struggling marketer, but it was pocket change in the realm of corporate finance. The equity Sylvia tried to extract from my coastal property exceeded $2 million. You do not steal $2 million to cover an $80,000 mistake. This ledger is not Greg's, I whispered, the realization settling like frost over my skin. These are Sylvia's internal accounting records. David nodded. He pulled a separate file from the pile, handing it to me. I ran a background trace on your mother-in-law's real estate brokerage while you were reading. Sylvia manages commercial escrow accounts for a dozen high-net-worth investors in Portland. By law, those funds must remain untouched until closing. But according to her own hidden ledger, she has been siphoning cash from those escrow accounts for years to fund her lavish country club lifestyle and sustain her failing commercial properties. I stared at the columns of siphoned funds. The math was elegant and ruthless. Sylvia had created a Ponzi scheme within her own brokerage. She used new client deposits to cover the gaps left by previous thefts. It is a common, desperate tactic among corrupt real estate brokers, and it always operates on a ticking clock. The music is stopping, David said, leaning over the bed. The Maine Real Estate Commission flagged her brokerage for irregularities last week. A federal auditor is scheduled to review her escrow accounts by the end of the month. When they look under the hood, they are going to find a multi-million-dollar crater. She needs a cash injection, I reasoned, my mind snapping the puzzle pieces together with clinical precision. She cannot take a traditional commercial loan because a bank would require an audit of her books, which would expose the embezzlement. She needed untraceable liquid cash, and she needed it immediately. So she looked at her wealthy daughter-in-law, David concluded. You bought that Cape Elizabeth sanctuary in cash, no mortgage, no liens. It was sitting there, a giant reservoir of pristine equity. She manipulated her son into forging your signature, planning to wash your stolen equity through this shell company and dump it directly into her escrow accounts before the federal auditors arrived. The profound cruelty of the arrangement took my breath away. Greg was not just a pawn, he was a human shield. Sylvia was orchestrating a federal corporate crime and positioning her own son to take the fall. If the authorities traced the forged deed, Greg's signature was the one on the paper. Greg's name was listed as the liable guarantor. Sylvia would play the innocent, devastated mother, while Greg went to a federal penitentiary for wire fraud. It was a strategy she had perfected decades ago. Greg's late father had been a quiet, unassuming man. He died penniless of a sudden heart attack when Greg was in college. The family narrative always painted him as a tragic victim of bad business luck. But I remembered a conversation I had with Maria years ago, after 3 glasses of wine on a Thanksgiving evening. Maria told me her father did not die of bad luck. He died of stress, crushed beneath the weight of toxic commercial loans that Sylvia had forced him to co-sign to protect her own assets. Sylvia was repeating the cycle. She cannibalized her husband to save her empire, and now she was cannibalizing her son. And Greg, desperate for his mother's approval and terrified of his own mediocrity, was walking willingly into the slaughterhouse. I dropped the ledger onto the tray table. The sterile hospital room felt charged electric with the weight of the evidence. For 48 hours, I believed I was fighting a localized domestic betrayal. I thought the objective was simply to reclaim my house and initiate a divorce. The scope of the war had just expanded. This was no longer a civil dispute over marital assets. I was holding the physical proof of a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. I possessed the key to a federal indictment. We do not just file a civil suit, I told David, my voice steady, stripped of any lingering vulnerability. We package this ledger. We build a flawless, audited dossier detailing the escrow theft, the shell company structure, and the wire fraud attempt. We hand it directly to the federal prosecutor's office. David offered a grim, satisfied smile. It was the expression of a litigator who had just been handed a loaded weapon. I will begin drafting the brief tonight, he said. We will dismantle her brokerage brick by brick. He packed the documents back into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut. You need to rest, Ellen. The spinal trauma is severe. Let me handle the legal maneuverings. I will return tomorrow morning with the preliminary filings. David turned and walked out of the recovery room, leaving me alone with the quiet hiss of the oxygen regulator. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the night began to recede, leaving a profound, hollow exhaustion in its wake. I closed my eyes, intending to sleep for the first time in 2 days. My burner phone vibrated against my hip. I pulled the device from beneath the blanket. It was an automated text alert from my primary banking institution. I swiped the screen to read the notification. The message consisted of 2 sentences that shattered my brief moment of triumph. Your Platinum credit account has been suspended due to suspected fraudulent activity. Please contact the fraud department during normal business hours to verify your identity. I frowned. I opened my secure banking application to check my secondary checking account. The screen flashed a red error code. Account frozen pending security review. I tried a third account, a high-yield savings portfolio I managed exclusively for emergency liquidity. Frozen. A cold dread washed over my skin. Sylvia had realized her equity loan was halted by David's injunction. She knew she could not extract the cash from my house. Instead of retreating, she was escalating the siege. Sylvia sat on the board of directors for a regional commercial bank. She possessed deep, entrenched connections throughout the Portland financial sector. She was utilizing that institutional influence to systematically starve me of resources. By flagging my accounts for fraud under the guise of protecting an incapacitated surgical patient, she triggered automatic security lockdowns across my entire financial portfolio. I was locked out of my own money. I had no access to cash, no ability to pay David's retainers, and no way to secure independent housing. I was a wealth management consultant with millions of dollars in assets, trapped in a hospital bed, rendered entirely destitute by a phone call. The hospital administration still viewed Greg as my emergency contact. If I stayed in this bed, Sylvia would use my lack of funds to force me into a state-run psychiatric facility, claiming I could not afford independent care. I threw the burner phone onto the mattress. The rules of engagement had changed. I could not fight a financial war from a recovery ward. I had to rip the IV out of my arm, discharge myself against medical advice, and step out into the freezing Maine air without a single dollar to my name. I peeled the transparent medical tape from the back of my left hand. The adhesive pulled at my skin, a sharp, stinging sensation that grounded me in the immediate reality. I gripped the plastic hub of the intravenous catheter and slid the needle out of my vein. A single drop of crimson welled up stark against my pale flesh. I pressed a sterile cotton swab over the puncture and applied steady pressure. The morning charge nurse stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her scrubs, holding a rigid plastic clipboard. Leaving, against medical advice, less than 48 hours after a lumbar fusion is an exceptional risk, she warned, her tone flat and uncompromising. You are risking severe infection and structural failure of the surgical hardware. I took the clipboard from her hands. I grasped the blue pen and signed my name across the liability waiver. I understand the risks, I replied, my voice steady despite the jagged fire radiating through my lower back. I gathered the generic gray sweatpants and the thin zip-up hoodie Maria had smuggled into the room the previous evening. Dressing myself was a grueling, agonizing ordeal, but I managed it without asking for assistance. I walked down the sterile corridor, each step sending a fresh wave of agony up my spine. The sliding glass doors parted, and the biting cold of the Maine morning air hit my face. I stood on the concrete curb. I was a senior wealth management consultant. My personal financial portfolio rivaled the executives sitting in the downtown Portland high-rises. Yet I stood on that sidewalk without a single dollar my credit cards, frozen by a mother-in-law who weaponized her banking connections to starve me out. A dark, nondescript sedan pulled to the curb. The passenger door opened. Maria sat behind the wheel, her dark eyes scanning the hospital entrance for any sign of Greg or Sylvia. I eased myself onto the fabric seat, bracing my core to absorb the impact of the closing door. "Where to?" Maria asked, merging seamlessly into the morning traffic. "I need a staging ground," I told her, clutching the burner phone in my lap. "Something discreet, short-term rental, cash only. No credit cards tied to my name or yours. Sylvia has flagged my entire financial identity. If we leave a digital footprint, she will find us." Maria drove to the industrial outskirts of the city. She secured a sparse utilitarian room above a quiet diner, paying the landlord a month of rent in advance, using the thick roll of $100 bills from her tote bag. The room smelled of old dust and industrial floor cleaner. It featured a sagging mattress, a faded laminate dining table, and a single window overlooking a bleak alleyway. The suffocating claustrophobia of the intensive care unit vanished instantly, replaced by the cold, harsh reality of total isolation. I was cut off from my home, my firm, and my liquid cash. Maria set a cardboard cup of black coffee on the laminate table, followed by a paper bag containing a generic phone charger. "Sylvia is not retreating," Maria said, pulling up a local social media feed on her sleek smartphone. "She hosted a breakfast committee meeting at the country club this morning. She told the entire board of directors that your anesthesia caused a severe cognitive break. She is painting Greg as a tragic, devoted husband trying to manage an erratic, vindictive wife. She claims you froze your own assets in a fit of post-operative paranoia and ran away from the hospital." I took a sip of the bitter coffee, letting the heat map the back of my throat. I did not cry. I did not throw the coffee cup against the faded wallpaper. Emotional reactions are an expensive indulgence I could not afford. Sylvia understood that, in the upper echelons of Portland society, perception is actual currency. By controlling the narrative, she sought to isolate me from any potential allies, professional resources, or sympathetic peers. She wanted me to look unhinged, so that when I finally presented the truth, the elite circles would dismiss me as a hysterical, discarded spouse. I set the coffee down and unclasped the heavy manila envelope Maria had rescued from the grandfather clock. I spread Sylvia's hidden corporate ledger across the cheap laminate table. The battery icon on my burner phone blinked red, hovering at 14%. I plugged the device into the wall outlet. I had David operating entirely on pro bono hours. I had a sister-in-law financing my basic survival. I had to build a weapon out of ink paper and irrefutable math. I spent the next 10 hours dissecting the escrow accounts. I ignored the screaming pain in my spine. I traced the flow of stolen capital with clinical precision. Every time Sylvia transferred funds from an investor deposit to cover her personal commercial debts, I documented the date, the routing number, and the precise federal banking statute she violated. I mapped the Ponzi scheme she ran inside her own brokerage. I highlighted the exact moments she bled her clients dry to maintain her pristine country club facade. Then I turned my focus back to the incorporation documents of the shell company holding my forged deed. I read the fine print, the dense legal jargon David had flagged hours earlier. The structure revealed a fatal vulnerability in Sylvia's grand strategy. Sylvia was arrogant, but her arrogance bred sloppiness. She had listed Greg as the primary liable guarantor on the paperwork, legally binding him to the debt of the hard money loan. But she kept the sole managing authority and the sole access to the receiving bank accounts entirely for herself. Greg was holding all the legal liability without possessing a single drop of actual power or equity. If the federal authorities investigated the wire fraud, the paper trail would point directly to his forged signature and his guarantor status. Sylvia could feign ignorance, claiming her son set up the company without her full understanding. She was positioning him as the perfect disposable fall guy. I tapped my pen against the laminate table. Greg was terrified of failure, but his deepest unspoken fear was his mother's betrayal. He spent his entire life seeking her approval, bending to her will, forging his own wife's signature just to appease her endless demands. He believed they were partners in this crime. He thought he was securing a windfall that would erase his quiet, embarrassing debts. He did not know the shell company was a trap designed to sacrifice him. I opened the messaging app on the charging burner phone. I could not fight a unified front. I had to fracture their toxic alliance. I needed to show Greg the exact dimensions of the cage his mother had built for him. If I planted the seed of doubt, his innate cowardice would do the rest of the work for me. I began drafting an anonymous, untraceable email, preparing to attach the specific pages of the legal documents that detailed his unrewarded liability. I sat at the faded laminate dining table in the sparse rental room. The harsh blue glare of the burner phone screen illuminated the dark circles under my eyes. I navigated to a secure, encrypted email service based on overseas servers. The platform required no personal identification, no linked phone numbers, and left 0 digital breadcrumbs. I created a blank account. The email address was a random string of alphanumeric characters, a ghost transmitting from the void. I picked up the physical LLC incorporation documents David had procured from the title company. The heavy paper felt rough against my fingertips. I turned to page 4, the liability clause. I smoothed the document flat against the table and positioned the burner phone camera directly over the fine print. I tapped the screen to force the lens to focus. The text sharpened into perfect, damning clarity. I captured the image. I turned to page 7, the Asset Distribution Agreement. This paragraph detailed Sylvia retaining sole managing authority and exclusive access to the corporate receiving accounts. I photographed that page as well. I attached both high-resolution images to the encrypted draft. The subject line needed to bypass his natural avoidance of conflict. Greg operated his boutique marketing firm by delegating difficult tasks and ignoring unpleasant realities. He filtered his inbox rigorously. I typed a single phrase in the subject line: urgent legal liability notification regarding Cape Elizabeth escrow. In the body of the email, I did not issue threats. I did not hurl emotional accusations or demand an apology. Emotion can be dismissed as hysteria. Math cannot be unread. I composed 3 concise sentences. Review the attached corporate filings for the shell company holding the forged deed. You possess zero equity and zero control over the incoming wire transfer. You are listed solely as the primary liable guarantor, positioning your signature to absorb the entirety of the federal wire fraud penalty. I entered his personal email address. My thumb hovered over the send button. I pictured Greg sitting in his sleek downtown office, sipping an expensive latte, scrolling through social media while he waited for his mother to hand him a stolen windfall. I pressed send. The encrypted message vanished into the digital ether. I plugged the burner phone back into the wall outlet and waited. Outside the single window, a cold, relentless Maine rain began to fall, washing the grime from the alleyway below. My fused spine radiated a deep, persistent ache, a stark reminder of the physical vulnerability I had endured just 48 hours prior. But the psychological leverage had shifted. I was no longer the paralyzed victim trapped in an intensive care unit. I was the architect of their ruin. Greg possessed a fragile, curated ego. He spent his entire adult life desperately seeking his mother's approval, twisting himself into knots to appease her endless demands. He forged his own wife's signature because Sylvia convinced him they were unified partners in a brilliant financial maneuver. He believed this theft would erase his quiet, embarrassing debts and elevate his status within her inner circle. He lacked the analytical stamina to read the fine print of the documents she placed in front of him. He trusted her. That blind, unearned trust was the exact fault line I aimed to strike. 45 minutes later, the burner phone vibrated against the laminate table. The screen lit up. Greg's cell. I did not reach for the device. I sat perfectly still, watching the screen glow in the dim room. The phone buzzed a rhythmic, desperate tempo. It rang until the cellular network routed the call to the automated voicemail system. The screen went dark. A minute later, a small notification icon appeared. One new message. I tapped the screen and pressed the speaker icon. Ellen, Gregg said. His voice was tight, layered with a thin veneer of forced calm. I know you are checking your messages. I got an insane email from some anonymous server. Someone is sending me doctored legal papers. Call me back. We need to talk about this situation before it spirals out of control. I am worried about your recovery. I deleted the voicemail. He was still clinging to the narrative Sylvia had constructed. He was still trying to gaslight me, projecting an aura of control. He needed to verify if I was the source of the leak, testing the waters to see if I possessed the actual physical ledger. I did not respond. Silence is a profound weapon. It starves the opponent of information, forcing their own paranoia to fill the void. 10 minutes passed. The phone vibrated again. Greg's cell. I let it ring. It went to voicemail. 10 more minutes passed. Another call. Another unanswered ring cycle. By the 5th missed call, the forced calm in his voicemails shattered. The progression of his panic was a fascinating psychological study. I listened to the 4th recording. The background noise had changed. He was no longer in his quiet office. I heard the muffled roar of a car engine, accelerating the rhythmic squeak of windshield wipers and the blaring horn of passing traffic. Ellen, pick up the phone, he shouted, the audio distorting slightly against the microphone. Did you send this? Tell me where you got these documents. I just drove to the title company and they refused to speak to me. The closing agent said there is an injunction. What did you do? Call me right now. He was unraveling. The reality of the liability clause had breached his defenses. He realized the equity loan was frozen, the cash was inaccessible, and his signature remained on a fraudulent corporate filing. The domino I pushed had finally struck the next tile. I stood up from the table, pacing the short distance across the faded carpet to stretch my stiff, aching legs. Maria arrived an hour later, carrying a fresh bag of groceries and 2 bottles of sparkling water. She shook the rain from her trench coat and tossed her leather tote onto the sagging mattress. I just did a drive-by of Sylvia's real estate brokerage, Maria announced, unscrewing the cap on a water bottle. The toxic alliance has officially imploded. I stopped pacing. Tell me what you saw. Maria offered a cold, satisfied smirk. Greg's car was parked diagonally across 2 handicapped spaces in front of her building. I sat across the street and watched through the plate glass windows. He stormed into her private office. I could not hear the dialogue, but the body language was unmistakable. He was waving a stack of printed papers in her face. Sylvia stood up from her mahogany desk and pointed her finger directly at his chest. They were screaming at each other. Greg threw a decorative paperweight across the room. It shattered against the drywall. Sylvia summoned the building security guard to escort her own son out of the lobby. The image of Greg being physically removed from his mother's empire painted a vivid picture of his total defeat. He confronted her with the email. He demanded an explanation for the corporate trap she built for him. Sylvia, cornered by her impending federal audit and enraged by the failure of the equity theft, dropped the maternal facade. She told him the truth. She told him he was a disposable shield. She confirmed the liability was his to bear alone. My phone vibrated on the table. It was the 12th call from Greg. I pressed the red icon, sending him directly to voicemail without letting it ring. A notification chimed a moment later. I played the new audio file on speaker so Maria could hear. "Ellen, please," Greg begged. His voice cracked high and thin with raw terror. The background noise indicated he was sitting in his parked car. The engine idled. I confronted her. "You were right about the paperwork. She set me up. She told me I owed her this because she covered my firm's losses last quarter. She said the feds are looking at her escrow accounts, and she needed the cash to balance the books. She told me to fall in line or she will hand the forged deed to the prosecutor and swear I did it without her knowledge. I have nothing, Ellen. My accounts are overdrawn. She holds all the cards. I am so sorry. Please call me back. We can fix this. I will do whatever you want. Please do not let her send me to prison." The audio cut out, leaving a heavy, resonant silence in the sparse rental room. Maria stared at the phone, her dark eyes devoid of any familial sympathy. "He sounds exactly like our father did right before the bank foreclosed on the family estate," she whispered. I picked up the burner phone. I felt a profound, icy detachment from the man crying on the recording. The husband I knew was a fiction, a pleasant mask worn by a coward. I would not negotiate a truce with a coward. I would not offer him a lifeline. I intended to let his paranoia simmer in the dark until he broke entirely. A new message arrived. This one was a text from David. "The trap is set," David wrote. "I filed an emergency motion to compel a civil deposition regarding the forged deed. The judge granted it. We have Sylvia on the record tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. She thinks she is untouchable. She thinks it is her word against a surgical patient. Let us see how confident she feels under oath." I locked the screen. The financial starvation, the isolation, and the fractured alliance were merely the opening maneuvers. The true reckoning required a sworn transcript, a quiet conference room, and the digital audio file resting securely on my smartwatch. The psychological warfare was over. The legal slaughter was about to begin. 10 o'clock the following morning arrived with a biting coastal chill. The conference room inside David's downtown Portland law firm was a theater of sterile precision. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a panoramic view of the gray Atlantic Ocean, but the temperature inside the room felt significantly colder than the weather outside. I wore a structured charcoal blazer draped over a loose silk blouse to accommodate the rigid medical brace encasing my lower torso. I leaned on a sleek carbon fiber cane. The physical toll of the spinal fusion remained a heavy burden, but the narcotic fog was gone. My mind operated with crystalline clarity. Greg and Sylvia sat across the wide mahogany table. The contrast between mother and son was stark. Greg looked hollow. He wore a wrinkled dress shirt, his tie loosened, his eyes darting frantically around the room. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed a sleepless night spent agonizing over the anonymous email I had sent him. He knew his mother had positioned him to absorb the federal wire fraud penalty. He sat as far away from her as the leather chair permitted, his knee bouncing in a rapid, nervous rhythm. Sylvia projected a masterclass in rehearsed invulnerability. She wore a pristine ivory designer suit, her hair styled in an immaculate silver bob. She sipped sparkling water from a glass tumbler, treating the deposition not as a legal reckoning, but as a minor administrative inconvenience. Beside her sat a high-priced defense attorney she had retained from a prestigious Boston firm. He arranged his legal pads with quiet confidence, unaware he was steering his client into a fatal snare. A certified court reporter sat at the head of the table, her fingers resting lightly over the keys of her stenograph machine. The small red light on her digital recorder blinked, signaling the official start of the proceeding. "State your full name for the record," David began, his voice a flat, unyielding baritone. Sylvia gave her name, her tone dripping with polite condescension. The court reporter administered the oath. Sylvia raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth under penalty of perjury. That single utterance sealed her fate. She bound herself to the legal transcript, stepping willingly onto the trap door David had built. David did not rush. A skilled litigator understands the value of a slow, methodical pacing. He started with foundational questions. He established her occupation as a real estate broker, her relationship to me, and her presence at the hospital on the day of my surgery. Sylvia answered each inquiry with practiced ease. She leaned back in her chair, steepling her manicured fingers, eager to control the narrative. "Let us discuss the Cape Elizabeth property," David said, opening a manila folder and extracting a copy of the forged deed. "Did you facilitate the transfer of this real estate asset into a limited liability company 48 hours ago?" "Yes, I did," Sylvia answered smoothly. "Under what specific legal authority did you execute this transfer?" David asked, maintaining eye contact. Sylvia offered a patronizing smile. "Under the authority of the property owner. Ellen gave me explicit verbal consent to manage the asset." Greg stopped bouncing his knee. He stared down at his hands, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. He knew she was lying, but the weight of his own complicity kept him silent. David paused, allowing the silence to stretch. He picked up his pen and tapped it against the legal pad. "Verbal consent. Are you testifying that Ellen Taylor, a senior wealth management consultant who operates entirely through audited contracts and secured digital signatures, authorized the transfer of a $2 million coastal property using nothing but a spoken request?" "It was a family matter," Sylvia countered, her voice hardening. She was facing a terrifying, high-risk spinal surgery. She was deeply concerned about market volatility and the potential length of her recovery. She asked Greg and me to restructure her portfolio to protect the family capital. We were simply carrying out her wishes to ease her anxiety. David leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He was handing her the shovel, inviting her to dig the hole as deep as her arrogance permitted. "I need to understand the precise timeline of this alleged conversation, Mrs. Taylor. When exactly did Ellen grant you this sweeping authority?" Sylvia did not hesitate. Her ability to fabricate detailed fiction was terrifying. "It occurred in the pre-operative staging area," she testified, looking directly at the court reporter to ensure her words were captured. "Approximately 1 hour before they administered the anesthesia, Ellen was sitting up in bed. She was entirely lucid. She held my hand, looked me in the eye, and told me to initiate the LLC transfer." "And your son Greg was present for this conversation?" David inquired. "Yes," Sylvia confirmed. "He witnessed the entire exchange." David turned his gaze toward Greg. "Is that correct, Mr. Taylor?" Greg swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. He looked at his mother, searching for an escape route, but found only her harsh, commanding glare demanding his compliance. "Yes," Greg whispered, his voice cracking. "That is what happened." David turned his attention back to Sylvia. "I want to be profoundly clear about your testimony, Mrs. Taylor. You are stating under oath that Ellen Taylor was fully awake, conscious, and communicative when she authorized this transaction. You are testifying that she was not incapacitated, heavily sedated, or asleep. She was wide awake," Sylvia declared, her tone echoing with false righteousness. "I would never conduct a financial transaction if she were incapacitated. That would be unethical." David set his pen down. He looked across the table at me and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. I reached across my body with my left hand. I unbuckled the sleek black smartwatch from my right wrist. The metallic clasp clinked softly in the quiet room. I placed the device squarely in the center of the polished mahogany table. Sylvia frowned, her gaze dropping to the watch. Her Boston attorney sat up straighter, a sudden flicker of unease crossing his features. He recognized a deviation from standard procedure. "What is this?" the defense attorney asked, raising a hand. "This is the end of the deposition," David replied. He pushed the smartwatch closer to the center of the table. "Play the file, Ellen." I tapped the glass screen. I accessed the encrypted audio folder and pressed the playback icon. I had maximized the volume settings. The sterile conference room filled with the unmistakable rhythmic hiss of a hospital oxygen regulator and the steady chirp of a cardiac monitor. The ambient noise established the exact setting. Then Sylvia's recorded voice cut through the silence, sharp and hurried. "The title company needs the wet signature by noon. Did you bring her blue pen?" Greg flinched physically, as if he had been struck across the face. He shrank back into his leather chair, his eyes wide with horror. "I have it," Greg's recorded voice answered. "But if she wakes up before the notary gets here—" "She will not," Sylvia's voice interrupted, cold and calculating. "The nurses bumped her morphine dial an hour ago, just like I asked. She is out for the day. Just guide her hand." The audio captured the rustle of the hospital bedsheets, the faint scratching of the fountain pen nib against the heavy paper, and Greg's final, damning confirmation. "Done. The house is out of her name." I tapped the screen, stopping the playback. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was not a quiet born of peace. It was the vacuum created in the immediate aftermath of an explosion. The court reporter had stopped typing, her hands frozen above the keys. Sylvia stared at the smartwatch. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale and hollowed out. The immaculate facade of the confident matriarch shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords refused to produce a sound. Her defense attorney moved with the speed of a man trying to outrun a falling building. He slammed his hands flat onto the table, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and sheer panic. "Recess," the attorney shouted, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "I demand an immediate recess. This proceeding is halted. My client will not answer another question." "You can halt the proceeding," David said, his tone devoid of any mercy. "But the transcript is already certified. Your client has provided sworn, detailed testimony that contradicts a digital audio recording of her orchestrating a forgery on a sedated patient. That is perjury in a civil deposition. And because this forged deed was used to cross state banking lines, that perjury falls under federal jurisdiction." Greg buried his face in his hands, letting out a ragged, miserable sob. The reality of his liability clause and his recorded complicity crashed down upon him simultaneously. Sylvia did not look at her son. She did not look at her lawyer. She looked directly at me. The fear in her eyes morphed into a dark, cornered desperation. The trap had sprung flawlessly. She was legally ensnared, facing imminent federal prosecution, and her multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme remained dangerously unfunded. The defense attorney grabbed Sylvia by the elbow, hauling her out of her leather chair and dragging her toward the door. "We are leaving," he barked. I watched them flee the conference room. I did not smile. The victory was precise, but the war was not over. A cornered animal is infinitely more dangerous than a confident one. Sylvia knew the legal route to stealing my equity was dead. She knew the federal auditors were days away from discovering the crater in her escrow accounts. With the perjury trap closing around her neck, she had nothing left to lose. David packed his legal pads into his briefcase. "We have her," he murmured. "I will send the transcript and the audio file to the prosecutor before lunch." I leaned heavily on my carbon fiber cane, feeling the familiar grinding ache in my lumbar spine. "She is not going to surrender, David," I warned him, watching Greg slowly gather his coat and stumble out of the room like a ghost. "She is out of time and out of capital. She is going to execute a scorched earth maneuver." My intuition proved correct less than 4 hours later. Maria called the burner phone from her logistics office. Sylvia had bypassed her legal counsel entirely. She had just blasted a mass email to every high net worth client in her real estate portfolio, bypassing standard SEC regulations. She was utilizing her forged incorporation documents to launch an emergency, unregulated bridge loan offering, hosting a mandatory investor gala at the Portland Country Club that very evening. She intended to blindside her wealthy peers into signing over millions in unregulated cash to plug her embezzlement hole, while simultaneously planning a final, catastrophic public smear campaign to destroy my credibility before the federal authorities could intervene. I spent the afternoon at a local commercial print shop with Maria. We did not produce standard stapled packets. I paid for premium heavyweight paper and thick navy blue leather bindings. If you intend to dismantle a decades-old real estate empire, your execution must mirror the aesthetic of the target audience. High net worth investors do not read crumpled printer paper handed out in a panic. They read audited prospectuses. They respond to clinical bound data. I compiled 12 identical folders. Each one contained the offshore routing numbers, the internal accounting ledger proving the escrow theft, and the emergency injunction halting the hard money loan on my coastal property. It was the precise anatomy of a Ponzi scheme, documented and indexed. The physical toll of standing in the print shop sent jagged spikes of nerve pain radiating through my lower spine. My fusion surgery was only days old. My body demanded rest, but my mind ran on pure, cold adrenaline. I returned to the sparse rental room above the diner to dress for the occasion. I chose a tailored black wool coat over a simple, structured dress that concealed my rigid medical brace. I gripped my carbon fiber cane. The walking aid was a physical necessity, but it also served as a visual testament. Sylvia had spent the entire morning painting me as a hysterical, physically robust woman who suffered a sudden mental break. Walking into her curated event with a severe spinal injury and a cane would instantly shatter her fabricated narrative. Maria drove us to the Portland Country Club just after 7 in the evening. The sprawling Tudor-style clubhouse sat perched on a manicured hill overlooking the dark expanse of the Atlantic. The parking lot was filled with luxury sedans and imported sports cars. Sylvia had cast a wide net, inviting the most affluent members of the local elite to her emergency gala. The invitation had promised an exclusive invite-only presentation on a rare commercial bridge loan opportunity. In reality, it was a desperate cash grab. She needed to blindside her wealthy peers into handing over their liquid capital to plug the multi-million-dollar crater in her brokerage accounts before the federal auditors arrived. We bypassed the valet and parked near the service entrance. Maria offered to walk in with me, but I shook my head. This required a singular, focused presence. If we walked in together, Sylvia would attempt to frame it as a coordinated domestic dispute. If I walked in alone, leaning on a cane, holding nothing but audited financial records, I became an undeniable authority. I approached the grand double doors of the main ballroom. The heavy mahogany panels were propped open. A string quartet played a soft classical arrangement in the corner. The room smelled of expensive floral centerpieces, roasted tenderloin, and vintage champagne. Waiters navigated the crowded floor carrying silver trays. I paused at the threshold, scanning the room. Sylvia stood near the central fireplace, holding court. She wore a stunning emerald green evening gown, her silver bob catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. She was projecting extreme, desperate opulence. She smiled and touched the arms of the men and women standing around her, weaving a spell of exclusivity and charm. She was selling them a bridge loan for a bridge she had burned to the ground 3 years ago. I gripped the carbon fiber cane in my right hand and clutched the stack of navy blue leather folders against my chest with my left. I stepped onto the polished hardwood floor. I did not scream. I did not hurl accusations across the ballroom. The truth does not need to shout. It only needs to be distributed. My cane clicked a steady rhythmic tempo against the floorboards. The sharp sound cut through the low murmur of wealthy conversation. Heads began to turn. The elite circles of Portland society operate on strict social codes, and an uninvited guest arriving in a severe medical brace with a walking cane violated every unspoken rule. The Whisper Network initiated immediately. Eyes darted toward me, then back to Sylvia. I recognized the first target standing near the cocktail bar. Richard Sterling, a maritime shipping magnate whose company held 3 large commercial escrow accounts with Sylvia's brokerage. He had been a loyal client of hers for a decade. I walked directly up to him. He lowered his crystal tumbler, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Good evening, Richard," I said, keeping my voice low and conversational. "I recommend you review the escrow balances on page 4 before you sign any bridge loan agreements tonight." I handed him the first navy blue folder. He took it instinctively, the heavy leather binding commanding his immediate attention. I moved to the next table. I handed a folder to a prominent commercial developer, then another to a retired corporate judge who had played golf with Greg's father. I did not stop to explain or debate. I delivered the audits like a silent courier. With every folder I passed out, the ambient noise in the ballroom dropped a fraction of a decibel. The string quartet continued to play, but the guests had stopped speaking. The rustle of heavy paper turning echoed across the room. Sylvia noticed the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. She turned away from the fireplace. Her eyes locked onto me, and the emerald green gown seemed to lose its luster. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin a pale, ashen gray. The polished matriarch vanished, replaced by a terrified, cornered fraudster. She registered the navy blue folders in the hands of her most vital investors. She lunged forward, her high heels clicking frantically against the hardwood. She abandoned her refined posture, practically sprinting across the ballroom floor. "Ellen!" she hissed, her voice a strained, breathless whisper designed to avoid echoing. "What are you doing here? You belong in a hospital ward." I handed my 7th folder to a local venture capitalist standing just inches from Sylvia. "I am expediting their due diligence," I replied, my tone flat and clinical. "You invited them to invest in your commercial debt. I am simply providing the accurate balance sheets." Sylvia reached out to snatch the folder from the venture capitalist, but the man pulled his hands back, stepping away from her. He was already staring at the 2nd page, his eyes tracking the highlighted routing numbers that proved his own deposit had been siphoned into her personal accounts months ago. "This is a fabrication," Sylvia announced to the immediate circle of guests, her voice rising in a desperate, shrill panic. "She is suffering from post-operative delusions. These documents are forged. Please hand them to me. My legal team will handle this harassment." Richard Sterling closed his leather folder. He walked slowly across the floor, stopping directly in front of Sylvia. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly, devastatingly disappointed. The kind of disappointment that signals the end of a professional lifetime. "The routing numbers in this ledger match the internal transfer codes from my own bank," Richard stated, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of a ruined man. "You withdrew $700,000 from my commercial holding account last Tuesday, Sylvia. You did not ask for authorization. You stole it." The word hung in the air, a final, lethal verdict. Sylvia opened her mouth, searching her extensive vocabulary of manipulation for a lifeline. She found nothing. The Whisper Network that she had cultivated for decades, the same social weapon she used to isolate me just hours prior, instantly reversed its current. The affluent guests were no longer whispering about the erratic, vindictive daughter-in-law. They were whispering about the thief standing in the emerald gown. The social hierarchy of the room collapsed. Husbands leaned over to their wives, gesturing toward the exits. Investors pulled out their smartphones, tapping frantically on the screens to dial their private attorneys and federal banking contacts. The gala had transformed into a crime scene. I stood leaning against my carbon fiber cane, watching the empire burn. Sylvia stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the wealthy peers who were now staring at her with unveiled disgust. She was a social pariah, stripped of her influence, her capital, and her dignity in a matter of minutes. I turned my gaze toward the far corner of the room near the grand piano. Greg stood in the shadows, half concealed by a heavy velvet drape. He had watched the entire ambush unfold. He watched the investors read the ledgers. He watched his mother fail to defend the indefensible. Greg met my eyes across the chaotic ballroom. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He realized the wealthy victims in this room were not just calling their civil lawyers, they were calling the authorities. The federal audit was no longer a looming threat scheduled for the end of the month. It was going to begin tomorrow morning. And Greg knew his signature was the only one resting on the forged deed holding my coastal property. He took a slow step backward, retreating deeper into the shadows, his mind calculating his final, desperate move. He was going to run. But he was not running to protect his mother. The toxic alliance was dead. He was running to save himself, preparing to offer the federal prosecutors the only valuable currency he had left. The fallout from the Portland Country Club gala materialized with terrifying speed. In the realm of high finance, a ruined reputation is fatal, but stolen capital triggers a bureaucratic avalanche. The wealthy men and women who received my navy blue leather folders did not wait for the morning sun to demand answers. They unleashed their private legal teams before midnight. By breakfast, the whispered rumors of embezzlement had transformed into a synchronized legal siege. The Maine Real Estate Commission expedited their pending review, elevating the inquiry from a routine audit to an emergency federal intervention. I sat in the plush leather chair inside David's downtown corner office, watching the local news broadcast on a muted flat-screen television. The camera crew was stationed outside Sylvia's boutique brokerage. Federal agents wearing dark windbreakers carried cardboard boxes filled with paper records out the glass front doors. The subpoenas had dropped simultaneously across 3 different regional banks, freezing every corporate account tied to her name. The money laundering scheme was exposed to the harsh light of a government investigation. David poured 2 cups of black coffee from a silver carafe. He handed one to me, his expression reflecting a grim satisfaction. The FBI does not mobilize this quickly unless the victims have direct lines to the Justice Department, he noted, taking a sip. Richard Sterling and the other investors used their political capital to force the prosecutor's hand. Your mother-in-law is currently barricaded inside her primary residence, surrounded by defense attorneys who demand their retainers up front in untraceable cash. I adjusted the carbon fiber cane resting against my leg. My spinal fusion throbbed a dull ache that served as a constant reminder of the physical vulnerability they tried to exploit. "She is out of liquidity," I replied, my voice steady. "The bridge loan failed. The escrow accounts are empty. The federal asset freeze cuts off her remaining oxygen." Before David could respond, his desk phone chimed, a sharp double ring. He pressed the speaker button. The voice of his front desk receptionist filled the room. "Mr. Taylor is in the lobby," she announced, her tone laced with professional caution. "He does not have an appointment. He says it is an urgent matter regarding the federal subpoenas, and he is requesting 5 minutes of your time." David looked at me, raising an eyebrow in silent query. I gave a slight affirmative nod. "Bring him into the main conference room," David instructed. We walked down the carpeted hallway. The glass-walled conference room was the same space where Sylvia had committed civil perjury just 24 hours ago. When we entered, Greg was pacing the length of the long mahogany table. He looked entirely dismantled. His designer suit hung loosely on his frame. His tie was missing. The top 3 buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing a sheen of cold sweat on his collarbone. He stopped pacing when the door clicked shut, his bloodshot eyes locking onto my face. He did not look like the confident boutique marketing executive I had married. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had snapped shut over his leg. "Ellen," he breathed, taking a tentative step forward. His hands shook visibly. "Thank God you are here. I need to talk to you. I need to explain everything." "Take a seat, Greg," David commanded, his voice a flat wall of authority. "You are currently speaking to opposing counsel in an active civil fraud lawsuit. Anything you say in this room can and will be used against you in subsequent legal proceedings. Do you understand?" Greg swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He collapsed into a leather chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I understand," he muttered. "I do not care. I am not here to fight the civil suit. I am here to make a deal." I sat across from him, resting both hands on the curved handle of my cane. I felt no lingering affection, no residual heartbreak. I analyzed his desperation with the cold detachment of an auditor reviewing a bankrupt ledger. The man sitting before me was a bad investment I was finally writing off. "I am listening," I said. The two words hung in the sterile air, devoid of any emotional warmth. Greg ran a trembling hand through his unkempt hair. "The FBI agents raided my marketing office an hour ago," he confessed, his voice cracking under the weight of his terror. "They seized my hard drives, my server racks, and my filing cabinets. They showed me a copy of the Shell Company Incorporation documents, the ones you emailed me. They know my signature is on the fraudulent deed transferring your coastal property. The federal prosecutor is building a wire fraud conspiracy case, and I am the primary target because my name is on the liability clause." "You signed the document," David pointed out smoothly. "You physically guided her hand while she was medically incapacitated. The liability is yours." "I did it because my mother told me it was the only way to save the family," Greg pleaded, looking directly at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate hope. "She manipulated me, Ellen. She told me the real estate market was crashing and we needed to secure the equity before the banks called in her commercial loans. She swore you would understand once you recovered. I was stupid. I was blind. But I am not the mastermind. She embezzled those millions. She orchestrated the Ponzi scheme. I have internal emails, text messages, and voicemails proving she directed the entire forgery operation. I have the evidence to guarantee her conviction." I watched a tear spill over his lower eyelid and track down his unshaven cheek. He was offering to trade his own mother for his freedom. The toxic alliance was not just fractured, it was annihilated. He was willing to hand the federal government the final nails for Sylvia's coffin, provided he could save his own skin. "What exactly are you asking for?" I inquired, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I want to flip," Greg stated, using the crude terminology of a desperate suspect. "I will take this evidence directly to the United States Attorney. I will testify against her in open court. I will detail every hidden account, every stolen escrow deposit, and every lie she told the investors. But I cannot fight a two-front war. If the federal government indicts me, I will need a formidable defense fund. I need you to drop the civil lawsuit." He leaned closer across the mahogany table, clasping his shaking hands together in a posture of fervent prayer. "If you drop the civil damages, I can offer the prosecutor a clean guilty plea on a lesser misdemeanor charge in exchange for my cooperation against Sylvia. I can avoid a lengthy federal prison sentence. I will walk away from the marriage. I will not ask for a single dime of alimony or a split of the shared assets. Just release me from the civil liability, Ellen. Please, let me help you destroy her." The proposition hung in the quiet room. It was a transactional offer, stripped of all marital sentiment. He was attempting to leverage his betrayal of his mother into a get-out-of-jail-free card. He expected my hatred for Sylvia to blind my judgment. He assumed I would pay any price to see the matriarch fall, even if it meant letting the man who physically held the pen walk free. I looked at Greg, studying the weak, hollow architecture of his character. He spent his entire life hiding behind Sylvia's tailored skirts, enjoying the unearned privilege of her stolen wealth. When she demanded he steal from his own wife, he complied without hesitation. Now that the consequences had arrived, he was begging the victim to shield him from the executioner. I tightened my grip on the carbon fiber cane. "I do not negotiate with thieves," I told him. My voice was quiet, but it possessed a razor-sharp edge that cut through his desperate pleas. Greg blinked, the color draining further from his pale face. "What do you mean? I am handing you her head on a silver platter." "I do not need you to hand me her head," I replied, standing up slowly, ignoring the protest of my fused vertebrae. "I already possess the audited ledger. I already delivered the offshore routing numbers to the investors. The FBI does not need your emails to prove she embezzled the funds. The math proves the embezzlement. Your testimony is redundant. You possess zero leverage, Greg. But the forgery, he stammered, standing up in a panic. The prosecutor will want a witness to secure the forgery conviction. I have an audio recording of you orchestrating the forgery, I reminded him, my gaze locking onto his terrified eyes. I do not need your confession. The smartwatch recorded your crime. You are going to face the federal wire fraud charges, and I am going to pursue the civil lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress and financial damages to the fullest extent of the law. I will seize whatever meager assets you possess, and I will erase your name from my financial history. You are going to let me go to federal prison, he whispered, the reality of his doom settling over him like a heavy shroud. I am not letting you do anything, I corrected him, turning my back and walking toward the glass door. You forged the signature. You built your own cage. I am simply refusing to unlock the door. David opened the conference room door for me, offering Greg a final, chilling glance. The front desk will validate your parking, Mr. Taylor, David said dismissively. I suggest you retain a competent criminal defense attorney. You are going to need one. We left Greg standing alone in the glass room, a broken, discarded pawn, waiting for the federal agents to place him in handcuffs. The family structure was entirely dismantled. The son had abandoned the mother, and the wife had condemned the husband. But as I walked out of the law firm and into the cold Maine afternoon, my burner phone vibrated with an incoming text from an unknown number. Sylvia was cornered, stripped of her allies and staring down a federal indictment. She had nothing left to lose, which meant her final, desperate negotiation was about to begin. The text message glowing on my burner phone screen originated from an unregistered prepaid number, but the syntax was unmistakably Sylvia. She requested a private, off-the-record dialogue. She possessed no leverage, no remaining social capital, and no access to her frozen bank accounts. The FBI raid had stripped her of her pristine country club armor, leaving a terrified, cornered woman facing a federal indictment. I agreed to the meeting, stipulating a single condition. She had to come to me. I sat in the formal living room of my Cape Elizabeth property. The emergency locksmith had drilled out Greg's altered deadbolts 24 hours prior, securing my coastal sanctuary. A cold, relentless Atlantic wind battered the large bay windows, rattling the glass panes. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon polish and sea salt. The antique mahogany grandfather clock in the foyer ticked a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. I rested my hands on the curved handle of my carbon fiber cane, my posture rigid, despite the lingering pain in my fused spine. The doorbell chimed. I did not rush. I walked slowly across the hardwood floor, opening the heavy oak door. Sylvia stood on the front porch. The visual transformation was jarring. The confident, emerald gown-wearing matriarch who had ruled Portland society was gone. She wore a simple, unbranded gray wool coat. Her silver bob was unkempt, flattened by the coastal wind. Her hands trembled visibly as she clutched a thin leather portfolio against her chest. She looked fragile, aged and hollowed out by the sheer velocity of her downfall. "Come in," I instructed, stepping aside. My tone held zero hospitality. It was the voice of an auditor permitting a suspect into an interrogation room. Sylvia stepped over the threshold, her gaze darting around the foyer. She glanced at the grandfather clock, the exact hiding place where her criminal ledger had rested before Maria extracted it. She walked into the living room and stood near the stone fireplace. She did not sit down on the linen sofa. The power dynamic in the room was undeniable, and she recognized her position at the bottom of the hierarchy. Ellen Sylvia began, her voice a fragile, raspy whisper. "I want to thank you for agreeing to see me. I know you have every reason to lock the door and let the authorities handle the rest. State your purpose, Sylvia. I am expecting a call from my legal counsel in 20 minutes." I did not offer her a glass of water or an empty pleasantry. She took a shaky breath, attempting to deploy the only weapon she believed she had left, empty sentimentality. She unclasped her wool coat, her eyes brimming with manufactured tears. "We are family," she pleaded, her voice trembling with rehearsed grief. "I made a terrible, unforgivable error in judgment. The financial pressure of the brokerage was crushing me. I panicked. But underneath all of this legal chaos, we share a bond. Think about your late parents. They loved Greg. They believed in the sanctity of our family tree. They would not want to see their daughter-in-law tear this family apart in federal court. I stared at her, immune to the emotional manipulation. Mentioning my deceased parents was a tactical miscalculation. My father was a risk actuary who despised fraud, and my mother was an estate planner who built fortresses around her clients. They would have applauded the forensic audit I just executed. You did not panic, I corrected her, keeping my voice cold and surgical. Panic is a sudden, unthinking reaction. You spent weeks plotting a premeditated corporate raid on my personal assets. You bribed a hospital nurse to isolate me. You convinced your son to forge a deed while I lay paralyzed in a recovery ward. Do not weaponize my dead parents to excuse your theft. What do you want? Sylvia swallowed hard, the tears drying instantly when she realized the guilt trip had failed. She pivoted to a transactional plea. The FBI seized my corporate records, she admitted, her shoulders slumping. The United States Attorney is preparing a grand jury indictment for wire fraud and embezzlement. I am facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I will not survive a cage, Ellen. I am too old. You should have calculated that risk before you siphoned the escrow deposits, I replied. I can make restitution, Sylvia urged, stepping closer, her desperation bleeding through the veneer. I can reimburse your legal fees, every dollar you paid David, every expense you incurred. I will sign a binding promissory note today. Just tell the federal prosecutor you declined to testify. Tell them the audio recording on your smartwatch was a misunderstanding, a joke taken out of context. If the primary victim refuses to cooperate, the wire fraud charge loses its foundation. The prosecutor will drop the felony counts to a civil fine. I analyzed the sheer audacity of her request. She wanted me to perjure myself, to risk my own pristine professional reputation in exchange for a vague promise of future reimbursement from a woman whose bank accounts were currently frozen by the government. Your liquidity is zero, I reminded her. The federal authorities locked your checking accounts. You cannot pay a parking ticket, let alone a corporate litigation retainer. A promissory note from a bankrupt fraudster is worthless paper. Sylvia clutched the thin leather portfolio tighter against her chest. I am not bankrupt, she countered, her eyes flashing with a sudden feral intensity. The FBI froze the real estate brokerage because of the escrow discrepancies, but they did not touch my secondary holding firm. I own a separate, legitimate commercial debt portfolio. She unzipped the leather case and pulled out a stack of audited financial summaries, laying them carefully on the glass coffee table between us. It is a collection of performing commercial mortgages and corporate bridge loans, Sylvia explained, tracing the top page with a trembling index finger. The paper is clean. The underlying assets are secure. The holding firm is registered under a different tax identification number. The federal freeze missed it entirely. The portfolio yields a consistent, verified quarterly return. It is worth $4 million. I leaned forward, resting my weight on the carbon fiber cane, and scanned the top sheet. My eyes darted across the yield projections, the default rates, and the principal balances. Sylvia was telling the truth. The portfolio was a rare, uncontaminated asset in her otherwise toxic empire. It was her golden parachute, a hidden reservoir of wealth she had hoarded for exactly this type of catastrophic emergency. I am offering it to you, Sylvia said, her voice dropping to a harsh, desperate plea. I will transfer the entire holding firm into your wealth management portfolio, $4 million in clean, performing debt. All I ask is that you hand over the original digital audio file and sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the hospital forgery. Let me walk away with my freedom. She stood back, waiting for my greed to override my pursuit of justice. It was a substantial bribe. $4 million could purchase a lifetime of quiet luxury. But Sylvia fundamentally misunderstood my motivation. I did not orchestrate this counteroffensive for a simple financial payout. I engineered this war to ensure she could never victimize another person and to establish my total dominance over the empire she used to torment me. I picked up the summary sheet, running my thumb over the crisp paper. The commercial mortgages were lucrative, tied to prime real estate in downtown Portland. Owning this portfolio would effectively make me the primary creditor for half the commercial district. I set the paper down and looked directly into her terrified eyes. I will acquire the portfolio, I stated. Sylvia let out a ragged, shaking exhale, believing she had successfully purchased her salvation. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching for her pen. "I knew you were a pragmatist." "But I am not buying your silence," I continued, my voice slicing through her relief like a scalpel. "And you are not walking away." Sylvia froze, the pen hovering above the glass table. "What are you talking about?" "I do not accept bribes," I explained, standing upright, projecting a quiet, unyielding authority. "If I take this portfolio in exchange for burying evidence, I become an accessory to your federal crimes. I will not compromise my financial licenses for your convenience. We are going to execute a legitimate corporate acquisition. My wealth management firm will purchase your holding company, but I am not paying market value. I will purchase the entire $4 million portfolio for exactly $100,000, a fraction of its true cost." "That is theft," Sylvia gasped, her face flushing with sudden impotent rage. "You are stealing my retirement. I am executing a distressed asset buyout," I corrected her. "You are a distressed seller facing imminent incarceration. The market dictates the price." "But the acquisition price is only the first condition." Sylvia gripped the edge of the sofa, her knuckles turning white. "What else?" "You will draft a formal sworn affidavit," I instructed. "In this document, you will confess to the unauthorized transfer of my coastal property, explicitly clearing Greg of the mastermind role and admitting your sole culpability in the forgery. You will sign it in front of a notary. And tomorrow morning, you will publish this confession as a full-page public apology in the main business journal." "You are asking me to humiliate myself in front of the entire city." Sylvia choked out, tears of genuine horror spilling down her cheeks. "You are asking me to sign a public confession that the federal prosecutor will read." "Yes," I affirmed, my gaze never wavering. "If you sign the portfolio over to me at a staggering loss and you publish the confession, I will decline to push the civil damages lawsuit against you. I will not hand the smartwatch audio file to the prosecutor. I will let them build their wire fraud case using only the paper trail. You might negotiate a plea deal that keeps you in a minimum security facility instead of a maximum security penitentiary." I tapped the tip of my cane against the hardwood floor. "But if you refuse my terms, I will send the digital audio file directly to the United States Attorney tonight. I will pursue the civil lawsuit until I seize this commercial portfolio anyway, and I will ensure you spend the next 2 decades in a federal cage." The ultimatum hung in the cold air of the living room. Sylvia stared at me, her mind racing through the inescapable logic of the trap. She had arrived expecting to negotiate a quiet retreat. Instead, she found herself staring down the barrel of a hostile corporate takeover. The sheer brutality of the choice paralyzed her. She could surrender her final asset and her public dignity to the woman she had tried to destroy, or she could lose her freedom entirely. The silence stretched tight and fragile, waiting for her to break. The silence in the coastal living room stretched into a fragile, agonizing expanse. The Atlantic wind continued to batter the bay windows, but the true storm was localized entirely within Sylvia. I stood leaning on my carbon fiber cane, watching the exact moment her vast, curated empire collapsed. She did not argue. She did not attempt another manipulation. Her shoulders caved inward, her spine curving as if the invisible weight of the impending federal indictment had physically crushed her posture. The realization that she possessed zero leverage settled over her features, leaving a hollow, defeated shell of the woman who had ruled Portland high society. "I will sign the portfolio over," Sylvia whispered. Her voice was thin, stripped of all its former resonance. "I will draft the confession. Just give me the paperwork." The capitulation was total. "We convene at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning at David's law firm," I instructed, my tone devoid of triumph or pity. "Bring your defense counsel. Do not be late." I opened the heavy oak front door. Sylvia walked out into the freezing Maine rain without buttoning her wool coat. She moved with the slow, uncertain gait of an exile. I closed the door, listening to the deadbolt slide into place. The Cape Elizabeth house was quiet again, the air cleansed of her toxic presence. The following morning, the conference room in downtown Portland felt different. The sterile, glass-walled theater no longer held the chaotic tension of a deposition. It was now a boardroom, prepared for a hostile corporate acquisition. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table. I wore a structured navy suit, projecting the clinical authority of a senior wealth management consultant closing a critical merger. Maria sat to my right. She wore a tailored black blazer, her dark hair pulled back in its signature severe clasp. She did not speak, but her presence was a physical testament to the new family paradigm. Greg was absent, discarded, and irrelevant. Maria represented the only genuine loyalty remaining in the room. At precisely 9 o'clock, Sylvia entered. She was accompanied by her deflated Boston defense attorney, who looked less like a legal warrior and more like a pallbearer. Sylvia wore the same gray coat from the previous night. She had not slept. Her eyes were bloodshot and her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the leather chair opposite me. David stood at the center of the table. He did not offer coffee or pleasantries. He opened his leather briefcase and extracted 2 distinct stacks of heavy, watermarked paper. "We are executing a distressed asset transfer," David announced, sliding the first stack across the polished wood. "This is the binding purchase agreement. Ellen Taylor, acting as the primary executive of her wealth management firm, is acquiring the entirety of your commercial debt portfolio. The stipulated purchase price is $100,000, payable via cashier check upon closing. This transaction encompasses every performing mortgage, every bridge loan, and every promissory note currently held by your secondary firm." The Boston attorney scanned the top sheet, his jaw clenching. "This valuation is punitive," he muttered, though his protest lacked conviction. "It is a fraction of the market yield. It is the cost of staying out of a federal penitentiary," David countered smoothly. "You are welcome to advise your client to reject the offer. The United States Attorney opens his office in 20 minutes. I have the digital audio file queued for delivery." The defense attorney fell silent, deferring to the brutal reality of their situation. David slid the second stack of paper across the table. "This is the sworn affidavit. It details your sole culpability in the forgery of the Cape Elizabeth deed. It exonerates your son of the mastermind role and explicitly admits your attempt to defraud an incapacitated surgical patient." Sylvia stared at the affidavit as if it were a venomous serpent resting on the mahogany table. "Read the final paragraph," I commanded. Sylvia hesitated, her trembling fingers hovering over the crisp white page. She lowered her gaze and read the text aloud, her voice cracking over the clinical, unforgiving prose. "I, Sylvia Taylor, publicly confess to orchestrating the fraudulent transfer of assets to conceal severe financial discrepancies within my commercial escrow accounts. I apologize to my investors, my family, and the Portland business community for my profound ethical failures." "That statement runs on the front page of the Maine Business Journal tomorrow morning," I informed her. "The publication fee has already been paid." A single tear tracked down Sylvia's pale cheek, falling onto the pristine legal document. She was signing away her wealth, her freedom from civil prosecution, and her public dignity in a single stroke. David placed a brass pen holder on the table. He reached into his suit pocket, intending to offer a standard legal rollerball. I raised my hand, stopping him. I opened my leather portfolio and extracted a specific writing instrument. It was a hard plastic barrel, a deep, vibrant blue, my favorite fountain pen. The exact pen Greg had forced into my paralyzed hand in the intensive care unit. "Use this," I said, sliding the blue pen across the smooth mahogany surface. It stopped directly in front of Sylvia. Sylvia recognized the object instantly. A fresh wave of horror washed over her features. She looked at the blue pen, then up at my face, realizing the depth of the psychological architecture I had built. I was not merely forcing a signature. I was reversing the trauma she had inflicted. I was making her conscious, willing, and desperate to sign away her life using the very tool she had chosen for my destruction. She picked up the blue fountain pen. Her hand shook so violently she had to brace her wrist against the edge of the table. She pressed the nib to the thick paper. The scratching sound echoed in the quiet conference room, a stark, agonizing echo of the forgery in the hospital ward. She signed the corporate acquisition agreement. She signed the asset transfers. Finally, she signed the public confession. David collected the documents, checking each page for the proper notary seals. "The transaction is complete," he stated, placing the papers into a secure folder. "The commercial portfolio is now the exclusive property of Ellen Taylor." Sylvia dropped the blue pen on the table. She pushed her chair back, eager to escape the suffocating room and retreat to whatever dark corner her ruined life permitted. "Wait," I said. Sylvia froze, her hands gripping her leather purse. "You need to understand the structural reality of this acquisition," I told her, my voice echoing with quiet, unyielding authority. "You just transferred the commercial debt portfolio to my firm. Do you realize what assets are bundled inside that paper?" Sylvia blinked, her mind too fractured by the surrender to run the financial calculus. "Let me clarify the ledger for you," I continued, leaning forward. "You transferred the mortgages for the prime real estate in downtown Portland. That includes the building where your boutique brokerage operates. It also includes the commercial lease on the private country club suites you utilize for your networking events." The realization hit her, draining whatever trace of color remained in her face. "I am your primary creditor now, Sylvia. I own the debt on your remaining legitimate properties. You are no longer a titan of Portland real estate. You are my tenant." I tapped my fingers against the mahogany table, driving the final nail into her empire. "The rent for your personal commercial office is due on the 1st of every month. The payments will be routed directly into the same accounts you attempted to drain while I lay paralyzed in a hospital bed. If you miss a single payment, if your check bounces due to your frozen assets, I will execute a swift, unforgiving eviction. I will seize the physical properties, change the locks, and leave your remaining inventory on the sidewalk." Sylvia swayed on her feet, the poetic justice of the trap snapping shut with flawless, lethal precision. She had tried to steal my home and leave me destitute. Instead, she had handed me the title to her entire world, forcing herself into a lifetime of financial servitude, paying monthly dividends to the woman she deemed disposable. She could not speak. The devastation was absolute. She turned and stumbled out of the glass-walled conference room, her Boston attorney following closely behind. I watched the heavy door click shut. The room felt lighter, the air crisp and clean. Maria reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. It was a silent gesture of profound respect and genuine family loyalty. We had cleansed the rot from the foundation. The matriarch was conquered, reduced to a tenant in a kingdom she once ruled. But the narrative required one final resolution to ensure the new baseline was secure, a conclusion that would deal with the coward who first put the blue pen in my hand. The 6 months that followed passed with a quiet, undeniable momentum. The brutal Maine winter yielded to a crisp coastal spring. The biting frost melted from the rocky shoreline of Cape Elizabeth, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of Atlantic salt and blooming pine. My physical recovery mirrored the changing season. The titanium hardware fusing my lower vertebrae had settled, integrating flawlessly with my skeletal structure. I no longer required the carbon fiber cane. I placed it in the back of a hall closet, allowing it to gather dust in the dark. I woke up at 5 o'clock every morning, unburdened by narcotic pain relievers or lingering trauma. I walked 2 miles along the ocean bluff. My stride was fluid, deliberate, and entirely my own. The physical therapy had been grueling, demanding a singular focus, but the discipline forged a renewed strength in my core. I was no longer the paralyzed patient trapped in a hospital bed. I was the undisputed architect of my own reality. The financial landscape of my life had undergone a similar rigorous transformation. My wealth management firm did not just recover from the attempted theft, it expanded exponentially. I utilized the commercial debt portfolio I acquired during the hostile takeover as a foundation for a new corporate division. We absorbed the performing mortgages and bridge loans, integrating them into our high-yield client offerings. The influx of clean, legitimate revenue doubled our operating capacity. I hired a dozen new analysts. We moved our headquarters into a premier downtown Portland high-rise. The specific building we occupied held a distinct historical significance. It was the exact commercial tower where Sylvia once operated her boutique real estate brokerage. I owned the debt on the property. When her federal embezzlement scandal broke, the remaining legitimate brokers fled her agency. The firm collapsed under the weight of the public confession I forced her to print in the main business journal. I seized the lease, gutted the opulent, outdated mahogany interiors, and renovated the entire floor with sleek glass partitions and modern digital infrastructure. Maria handled the physical logistics of the corporate transition. She sourced the contractors, managed the supply chains, and ensured the grand opening proceeded without a single delay. We stood together in the new lobby on our first day of operation. We did not toast with champagne or offer self-congratulatory speeches. We exchanged a brief acknowledging nod. We had excised the rot from the family tree and built a fortress in its place. Greg was absent from this new reality. He was a ghost excised from my life with clinical efficiency. The federal wire fraud investigation proceeded exactly as David predicted. Without the protection of his mother or the financial resources of his wife, Greg possessed no leverage. The prosecutor offered him a standard plea agreement, bypassing a lengthy trial. Greg stood before a federal judge in a rumpled suit, weeping as he confessed to forging the deed to my home. The judge noted his lack of criminal history, but cited the profound breach of trust, sentencing him to 36 months in a minimum security federal correctional institution located 3 states away. The divorce finalized shortly after his sentencing. Because he was incarcerated and destitute, the proceedings moved through the family court system without contest. I retained sole ownership of the coastal property, my investment portfolios, and the wealth management firm. Greg was stripped of every marital asset. He attempted to call me once from the prison phone system. I heard the automated prompt announcing a collect call from an inmate. I declined the charges and permanently blocked the institutional routing number. He had no commissary funds, no outside support, and no visitors. He was isolated, forgotten by the elite circles he once desperately tried to impress, left to serve his time in a sterile, structured vacuum. The matriarch fared worse. Sylvia avoided a federal prison sentence, but her survival came at a steep, humiliating cost. The public confession destroyed her social currency. The investors she defrauded pursued relentless civil litigation, draining whatever hidden cash reserves she had managed to conceal. She was expelled from the Portland Country Club. The affluent peers who once sought her approval now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. She was reduced to renting a cramped, outdated office on the industrial edge of town, attempting to broker low-income rental agreements just to survive. And she remained my tenant. I held the deed to the commercial strip mall where she leased her meager office space. The terms of our acquisition dictated that her rent was due on the first day of every month. I did not interact with her directly. My accounting department processed her checks. For 5 months, the payments arrived on time, drawn from a dwindling personal checking account. But the financial strain of her ruined reputation was a slow, inevitable poison. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the final validation arrived. I returned from my coastal walk, my lungs filled with the sharp, clean sea air. I unlocked the heavy oak door of my Cape Elizabeth home. The house was bathed in warm, natural sunlight. In the foyer, the antique mahogany grandfather clock ticked a steady, comforting rhythm. The brass pendulum swung in a flawless, uninterrupted arc. I walked to the entryway credenza. The morning mail rested in a neat stack. I sorted through the financial journals, the utility bills, and the corporate prospectuses. Near the bottom of the pile, I found a stark, white envelope. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was elegant cursive, though the loops and slants were shaky, lacking their former confident pressure. The return address printed in the corner belonged to the industrial strip mall. Sylvia had mailed it directly to my personal residence, bypassing the corporate accounting department. I did not need to open the envelope to understand its contents. The first of the month was approaching. Sylvia lacked the liquidity to cover her commercial lease. She was writing to beg for an extension. She was likely deploying her old tactics, pleading for a grace period, perhaps invoking some hollow sentimentality about forgiveness or second chances. She was hoping the passage of time had softened my resolve. She was hoping I would grant her the mercy she never intended to grant me. I stood in the foyer listening to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. I felt no anger. I felt no pity. I felt only a profound, clarifying indifference. The woman who wrote this letter was a stranger, a relic of a past I had systematically audited and erased. I walked down the hallway and entered my home office. Sunlight streamed across my pristine glass desk. Beneath the desk sat a heavy-duty cross-cut paper shredder. I pressed the power button. The machine hummed to life, a low mechanical growl, waiting for input. I did not break the seal on the envelope. I did not read her desperate excuses or her manufactured apologies. I held the crisp white paper between my index finger and thumb, suspended over the feeding slot. I let go. The sensor engaged. The steel blades caught the edge of the envelope, pulling it downward with swift, ruthless efficiency. The sound of the blades whirring and grinding the paper into thousands of illegible, confetti-sized fragments echoed in the quiet room. The mechanical crunch lasted only 3 seconds. Then the machine went silent, returning to its standby hum. The letter was gone, reduced to dust, its contents forever unread. I turned off the machine and sat in my leather desk chair. I opened my laptop, pulling up the daily yield projections for my wealth management firm. The numbers were flawless. The growth was exponential. I had protected my sanctuary, dismantled a toxic empire, and built a fortress on the ruins. The betrayal was designed to leave me broken and destitute. Instead, it provided the exact catalyst I needed to recognize my own unyielding power. I drew the boundaries of my life with clinical precision, and I would never allow another threat to cross the threshold. Thank you for tuning in to Linda Vengeance. If you have ever taken the broken pieces of a betrayal and used them to build an empire, let me know your story in the comments. Remember, your peace is not a negotiation, and your strength is never up for debate. Stay sharp, guard your assets, and I will see you in the next story. The most profound tragedies we witness in life rarely begin with a sudden, explosive betrayal. They do not start in a hospital room with a forged signature or in a glass-walled conference room during a hostile corporate takeover. The true genesis of a ruined life begins decades earlier in the quiet corners of a childhood home. It begins at the dinner table, in the car rides to school, and in the unspoken lessons passed from parent to child. When we look at the wreckage of Greg and Sylvia's family, it is easy to focus on the stolen equity and the federal wire fraud. But beneath the ledgers and the legal injunctions lies a far more devastating narrative, a cautionary tale about the monumental weight of parenting, family responsibility, and the moral compass we are tasked with handing to the next generation. In American culture, the traditional family structure has long been idealized as a sanctuary, a place where character is forged, where the virtues of honesty, fairness, and hard work are supposed to take root. We are taught that raising a child is about preparing them to step out into the world with a spine made of integrity. Parents are the architects of their children's earliest worldview. But what happens when a parent views a child not as a soul to be nurtured, but as an asset to be managed? Sylvia provided Greg with every material advantage a Portland country club lifestyle could offer. He wore the right clothes, attended the right schools, and learned the charming cadence of the elite. Yet she starved him of the one thing he actually needed to become a man: emotional awareness and a genuine sense of accountability. Sylvia did not raise a son, she cultivated a human shield. She taught him through years of subtle conditioning that loyalty to the matriarch meant abandoning his own moral center. When she manipulated his late father into toxic commercial loans, Greg was watching. When she demanded absolute compliance in exchange for her affection, Greg was learning. He absorbed the lesson that status was paramount and that honesty was merely a disposable inconvenience. This is the quiet, insidious danger of raising children without fairness and truth. When we fail to teach our children how to navigate failure, when we refuse to let them face the consequences of their own actions, we do not protect them. We cripple them. Greg's fatal flaw was not just greed, it was a profound, paralyzing cowardice, born from a lifetime of seeking a corrupt mother's approval. When the moment came to protect his wife, the woman he had sworn to love and honor, he could not find the courage to stand up, because that courage had never been built. He placed a blue fountain pen into the paralyzed hand of the woman who loved him, not because he hated her, but because his mother told him to. That is the true horror of a fractured upbringing. Parenting, at its core, is the ultimate exercise in long-term guidance. It is not about ensuring your children inherit a sprawling estate or a lucrative business portfolio. It is about ensuring that when they are tested by the inevitable storms of life, they do not shatter and they do not sell their souls to survive. Emotional awareness, the ability to look inward, to recognize right from wrong, to feel empathy for a vulnerable spouse lying in an intensive care unit, is a fundamental survival tool. When a traditional family structure functions correctly, it acts as a greenhouse for empathy. It demands that we look our children in the eye and tell them the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. It demands that we show them how to lose with grace, how to apologize with sincerity, and how to protect those who are weaker than they are. Sylvia bypassed all of these hard, necessary lessons. She built an empire on a foundation of sand, and she chained her son to the pillars just before the tide came in. The tragedy of Greg is that he was a victim of terrible parenting long before he became a perpetrator of terrible crimes. He traded his autonomy, his marriage, and ultimately his freedom, all for a fleeting nod of approval from a woman who viewed him as entirely disposable. He lacked the emotional framework to recognize that true familial love does not require you to commit a felony. As we navigate our own lives, building our careers and raising our families in a society that often prizes rapid wealth over quiet integrity, this story serves as a mirror. It forces us to ask ourselves, what kind of legacy we are truly leaving behind? Are we teaching our children to be architects of their own honorable lives, or are we training them to be pawns in someone else's game? The wealth we accumulate can vanish in a single federal audit, but the character we instill in our children echoes into eternity. We must consciously choose to prioritize honesty over optics. We must teach our sons and daughters that true strength is not found in manipulating others, but in the quiet, unyielding refusal to compromise one's own values. If we want our children to build fortresses instead of cages, we have to give them the right tools, the courage to speak the truth, the empathy to care for the vulnerable, and the wisdom to know that genuine loyalty is never conditional upon committing a fraud. We have a profound responsibility to guide our children, not just toward financial prosperity, but toward emotional resonance and moral clarity. If these reflections on family betrayal and the harsh realities of justice resonate with you, I invite you to join our community. Please follow and subscribe to the channel Linda Vengeance. We explore the deep, often uncomfortable truths about the people we trust the most and how we can rebuild our lives when those foundations crumble. Your support allows us to keep bringing these powerful, necessary narratives to light, helping us all navigate the complex dynamics of trust and truth. At the end of it all, we are left to consider the quiet moments that follow the storm. Think of Ellen standing alone in the foyer of her coastal home, listening to the steady, mechanical whir of the paper shredder as it destroyed Sylvia's final, unread letter. The house was finally peaceful, secured by her own unyielding boundaries. She had won the war, protected her assets, and severed the toxic roots that tried to pull her under. But as the sun sets over the cold Atlantic, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors, one cannot help but wonder about the spaces left empty. When you spend your entire life pruning a family tree, meticulously cutting away the rot and the decay to protect the core, you eventually secure the soil. But when you look up at the branches that remain standing, stark against the evening sky, you have to ask yourself, is the silence that echoes through the halls a victory? Or is it simply the hollow sound of realizing you were the only one in the room who ever truly understood what it meant to love?